great accounts here on Twitter. In addition, try to present tools and techniques. So whether you're new to analyzing open source info or you've been at it a while, hopefully you'll still find some things to take away, build your skills up. We pretty often will have guests on to present some great work that they're doing. Sometimes they're featured guests, where we do an interview for an hour. Sometimes they're just great friends of ours who are come by to talk about work that they've done. Tonight, we have a couple of our friends talking about some of their smaller projects, so I think that'll be really interesting. And if any of the work that they do intrigues you, reach out to them. Hopefully, we can build some collaboration. This space relies heavily on the use of the Nest, which is the space at the top of the window where links to individual tweets are posted. If you were to scroll all the way to the right-hand side, you'll see that's the invitation to tonight's space, which, of course, is not valid anymore because that initial space it kicked me and wouldn't let me reconnect. But if you click through to the thread below it, that includes my speaking notes. The reason I do that is so that you don't have to take my word for it. I try to provide sources for everything that I speak to. Also a good point to take away for further reading if you're interested down the road. By looking ahead at the agenda, you can also develop questions and comments. And when we get to that part of the conversation, please feel free to jump in. You can always do that by requesting the microphone, hitting the button in the bottom left-hand corner of the window. And we'd love to get as many people into the conversation as possible. And so if you're enjoying the talk, please do consider retweeting it. You can do that with the button that's in the bottom right-hand side of the Spaces window. Okay, I'll get into some of the introductory stuff, materials, resources. This conversation might take a little bit longer than usual because a couple of our friends are going to highlight the good work that they've been doing. It might take, 30, 40 minutes, but then we'll get into updates on the war in Ukraine. So once again, the first item in the Nest was the original link to the space. Again, the agenda is there if you click through to the thread. Our next conversation will be on Sunday at 4 p.m. We hold these talks every Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern and every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern. You can set your reminder now. The third item from the right is a link to the YouTube channel where some friends of ours are live streaming this discussion. I encourage you to participate here on Twitter because that's how you can come up to speak. But if you miss an episode and you want to go back, or if you may be driving, you may be doing some chores, perhaps it's easier for you, check out that YouTube account. The fourth item from the right links to our sort of community calendar. We do this because there are a couple of friends of ours who host spaces. And we thought if we had an internal calendar that we would put some outside events on it. There are lots of great talks from universities and think tanks. The calendar will open in your browser. Individual entries should open and will include either a link to registration for upcoming events or often there's a recording if it's a past event. If there are any items that you'd like to add to the calendar because you think people will be interested, do send them either to me or to Jacoby, who's on the panel here with me. A handful of events that are listed there, I won't break them out to the Nest individually, but if you click on that calendar section, you'll see that there's a talk that's going to be held by the Foreign Policy Research Institute covering the coup in Niger. Some of our friends, including Cassius Belli and Fabian and a handful of others, Nils, do great work covering developments in Africa. And, we also discuss some of these things in relation to talks about Wagner and our friends with All Eyes on Wagner. So that should be an interesting conversation. And there have been sort of low-level updates on that front in the last week or so. We haven't had the time in our talks to get to updates on Africa, but we are still keeping our eyes on it. The second item in that tweet is a conversation that was held. So it was the Carnegie Connects program discussing the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which had some terrific speakers, including Michael Kaufman and Dara Massicott. And both Michael and Dara have moved to the Carnegie Foundation, I think just in the last couple of weeks. So it's interesting to see how they're accumulating in that one think tank. So I anticipate good things from there down the road. The last item under events is a talk that's being put together by the Brookings Foreign Policy organization, and it will have several speakers, including Fiona Hill, talking about how to balance existential threats that flow from the war in Ukraine. And that's going to be on this Friday at 9 a.m., I believe 9 a.m. Eastern Time. Okay, moving along through the nest. Right in the, no, not the middle. We're now the fourth from the left. There were a couple of interesting podcasts in the last few days. So you'll see there that the first of them was an interview that the Economist magazine held with President Zelensky. And it was in this interview where Zelensky referred to several interesting details. One that we may talk about when we get to diplomacy is talking about how he will hear from many allies that they will support them till the end, but then he says he looks in their eyes and he's not so sure that they completely mean it. So if you're interested in those details, check out that talk. There was a conversation between Phillips O'Brien, who's a professor, I think, of war studies, speaking with Minna Allander, who does lots of great coverage of the Nordic countries. And they were chatting about security in the wider north, following the developments in the Russia-Ukraine war. There's also a talk that was put out by the Just Security podcast, and their guest was Richard Gowan, who is an advisor. He is with Crisis Group, and he is their UN director. So he was chatting about all the developments coming out of the UN General Assembly's upcoming annual meeting, including developments in connection with Ukraine. And I think it was just breaking this afternoon that President Zelensky will be planning to attend that. And then he'll go on to another meeting at the White House sometime next week. Under podcasts, there were two others I thought I'd highlight. One that was brought to our attention by some friends of ours who are interested in naval matters. It's the Sea Power podcast, and it's looking at the power that the military power that the Chinese merchant navy can be used for, in that there's a lot of crossover there. And so occasionally we've had talks on naval power, including in the Pacific, and that one was recommended from friends of ours. Finally, there was a new episode of the OSINT Bunker podcast that's put together by lots of great accounts here on Twitter: Defense Geek, OSINT Technical, Geo Allison, and our friend Austin often joins them as well. But I don't think he made it to this talk. Okay. So I'll move on to a couple of resources, which is the third tweet from the left. Or actually, excuse me, I'm going to start with this second tweet from the left. Again, I won't break these out individually, but if they catch your attention, do have a look into them. So the first is that there's a new collective platform that's being put out by the ACLED, which is the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. And they do great aggregation work. And they used to have several different tools that included data for early warning of potential violence or instability. And I believe it was about a month ago, they combined them all into one new tool, which is their Early Warning and Forecasting Hub. There was a talk that was held just this morning by Bellingcat. You'll see that's the second item in the tweet. It was one of their stage talks on Discord. And one of their advisors, Sophie Tedling, was speaking about the use of an app called Peak Visor, which is I've used something similar, I think, called Peak Finder, for purposes of geolocation in rural areas where you don't have, buildings for reference, but sometimes you can use elevation and peaks to do the same sort of thing. One other tool put together by Bellingcat that was highlighted, the third item down under to transcribe audio with Whisperbox. That links to, this is a tool that Bellingcat's had out for a little while. One of the OSINT sort of tool newsletters highlighted it again, so I thought I'd include it here just as a reminder. If you need to try to generate transcripts, particularly of longer audio, you can try that tool out. The last tweet in this particular item, and then we have a couple more resources, is it's the tweet by Malachi Brown, and he put together a Twitter list if you want to follow just the members of the New York Times Visual Investigations team here on Twitter. And even if you don't follow this list specifically, because it's, it's 18 members, you might consider incorporating some of these folks into other lists that you maintain, and or just giving the people on it to follow. This came up because the New York Times Visual Investigations team just hired Eric Toller, who was one of the lead researchers at Bellingcat in the last week. And as a result, Giancarlo at Bellingcat has taken over that role as their chief researcher. So folks are moving around, forming new teams. So it's good to keep track of where everybody is at the moment. The third item back in the nest contains a few more resources that you might find interesting. The first of which is the Kiev Independent has put out a new, I believe it's a weekly report called the Ukraine Business Roundup. They have been putting out for a while something called the State-Owned Enterprises Report, which is interesting, and I sometimes include their material here. But this is more broadly Ukrainian businesses, and not specific to state-owned enterprises. So I'm particularly interested in econ matters, and I think this is a great new product. The second item down there, if you're following agricultural developments, for example, the Black Sea Grain Initiative, or just interested in the Ukrainian economy, the second item there is the Global Agricultural Monitoring Program. And they've just updated their tool, and I think it has a new link, so you can see it there. It's, I believe they work in collaboration with NASA. So check out that link. Apparently there wasn't a lot of clarity around how some of the larger volunteer contributions to the project would continue with new owners. We didn't get into it too much. The reason I'm highlighting it now is because there has been a development, which is a lawsuit has actually been filed from one of the software development companies that developed a bunch of code that underlies parts of the ADSB system. Essentially saying that they wrote the code, they own it, they had granted license for its use to the ADSB project, but it's not something that's transferable in a corporate sale, and that could, really wrap the project up in litigation for a while. So we'll have to see how that goes. And related to that, I think there were some additional groups of contributors who had said, yeah, we're not interested in continuing. We're going to run sort of independent projects along this line for the time being. Yeah, Nukes, go ahead.
I just wanted to point out he's talking about ADSB Exchange specifically. ADSB is kind of the blanket term for the technology. Just wanted to point out the exact company we were speaking about.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying, because it's ADSB itself is just a standard, so it can't be sold. It can't be sort of the subject of controversy in the same sort of way. So it's the aggregator of data that Nukes is exactly right. And then the final resource that I'll highlight to you is a list. It's a tweet that was put together by a fella, Beefeater fella, and he just wrote out some phonetic pronunciations from the perspective of an English speaker of Ukrainian place names. And I know that there are lots of us who stumble with that, particularly if you have to discuss them in public, like Novoprokopivka, where I think some of us saw Andrew Perpetua's advice to cut off the Novo part, and then it makes the pronunciation easier. And the Beefeater fella has done sort of that same thing for several other place names. Okay, so moving to the first item in the nest. This has some good examples from the last week, and several of these are projects that friends of ours worked on. So you'll see that, I'll break these out to the nest so that you can see them a little bit more easily, and we'll get our friends to speak to them. So the first two are threads that were developed by Daniel, and they're just populating up now, and relate to FPV drones. The first is a general overview of how the video transmitted by some of these drones are susceptible to being intercepted, and then there are tactics that can be taken based on that information. And then the second thread from Daniel speaks to how it's affecting infantry strategy and options to harden these, as against electronic warfare attack, and what implications that may have for cost. Hopefully I haven't stolen too much of Daniel's thunder, but Daniel, thanks for joining us. If you'd like to walk us through these threads, we'd love to hear it.
Sure. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me.
Yeah, loud and clear.
Yeah, I got a thumbs up. Okay, perfect. Yes, I just kind of started recently tweeting about this war. And I put out this tweet on a fairly technical issue about how drones communicate. And right now I got over 39,000 views of that, which is, I find a bit interesting. But just so here I am. I'll just give a bit of background. I'm actually an imaging physicist. Over the years, I've made many, many different things. And one of the things I have made a lot of are radio-controlled planes. So that's kind of where I come from. And I have observed something very, very strange happening in Ukraine. And that strange thing is a major war is being strongly influenced by a hobby. So what I mean by that is, if you consider the kamikaze drones, all of the hardware used in the kamikaze drones was developed for drone racing. These are folks who have little quadrotor drones and they race around a parking lot or building site, and they're spectators and they have a good time. And that's where it came from. So there's some implications of this, because this stuff was never, ever, ever meant for a military application. Yeah, the components used in these drones are really cheap. They are really easy to source. Just to give you an idea, even though both the Ukrainians and the Russians have been buying the stuff like crazy, I recently just bought some myself from a local shop. No problem getting this stuff. So it's easy to source. There's open source software to program these things. That's very powerful and widely available. And very importantly, there's no encryption. That's on purpose. So as far as I can tell, these are all not typical military things. I don't think military is normally cheap, easy to get, open source and non-encrypted, as far as I can tell. That's not normally how things go. So this has led to a lot of drones being flown around with bombs stuck on the bottom of them. And I think this might be one of the reasons we're not seeing a lot of armor driving around in Ukraine right now. I did read in one of the Russian posts that if they see any kind of Ukrainian armor driving around, the drone operators really, really, really want to claim that as a kill for themselves. So it instantly has drones flying at the thing. So there's an interesting Telegram post and a YouTube post, I think I quoted them, where Ukraine is trying something different. And it's actually a tactic they're trying. So the commander of what they call a battalion, I don't know how many people that is, had set up 3 teams, each of 2 people, and they have a video monitoring station. So because the video is not encrypted, literally anyone can view it. So these folks have video stations that were made by some little company that might just be enthusiasts in Ukraine who put these together, and they spend all day and they sit there and they actually watch the video transmitted from the Russian drones as it is coming to attack them. Okay, you got that? So they're watching the bombs fly at them from the bomb's point of view. And what they do is they figure out, I think, which way the bombs are heading. And I think, thinking about this, I think this is just a consequence of how you would actually fly these drones. The drones are all flown visually. You cannot use GPS. That's just that's not possible. So they're flown visually, and in a landscape like Ukraine, where it's all fields with just bordered by roads and tree rows, it is really easy to get lost when you're flying an aircraft like that. I know that myself. Super easy. So very likely what the pilots of the drones do is they follow roads. They just travel along the roads, so you know where they're going. And so if you have an advanced video of them coming in, you know which road they're coming up. You can actually have the electronic warfare folks run over there, probably with portable systems. And these things are good enough to disable the control signals of the drones and interrupt those control signals. These drones, they're very heavy if you see them. They got a big battery pack on them, and they got a big munition hanging off the bottom. So they're quite heavy, which means they're probably not that easy to control. And if you have trouble with control, any kind of control inputs, it's going to very quickly crash. So I think that's what's going on there. They claim right now, in this little experiment they did, that they intercepted 61 out of 92 drones in 10 days. I hope those numbers are correct. I used the machine translation on YouTube, so that could be wrong. I did see other posts where Russians were complaining that as soon as their drones left the ground, they instantly would be hit electronic warfare, and they were having to try to work around that using high gain antennas and big amplifiers, but that only gets you so far. So that's all very interesting.
And just interrupt you, because that may lead into your second thread. To my mind, that implies a whole bunch of interesting questions about how quickly can they tune into the video broadcast. Are they likely operating in close enough proximity that they can be catching the very first scenes, like launch? I wonder if this leads to kind of a battle of tactics in an effort to get receivers moved forward as far as possible to catch the earliest hints of, the video that's being transmitted, so they can locate it. Because it strikes me that it's also partly like a geolocation race in real time, because the drone is in the air and they need to be able to recognize just from the footage where it is, so they can intercept it very quickly. So, it would be fascinating to know how the Ukrainians are doing it, but because of the back and forth in terms of tactics, I assume that this would be highly guarded OPSEC in terms of how they get the info, the data from, close receivers, and how they get teams to intercept them. So have you, in trolling around Telegram, have you seen any of those details coming out?
Actually, it is just the opposite. You got to remember, this stuff was meant for hobbyist racing drones. So one of the reasons the video is just either analog, well, one reason if they use analog is because it's cheap. It can be digital, still unencrypted. And the reason for that is so spectators can actually watch the video stream in real time. So the Ukrainians are just being spectators on these drones. Like, this is how it was meant to be used. Like, it doesn't make any sense, but here it is. Yes, also, the reason you cannot use GPS on these drones is because the way they works is the GPS coordinates are actually overlaid on the video stream before it's transmitted. So if you have GPS, as soon as you turn the drone on, you'll actually instantly transmit the video with your location on it, which will probably result in a visitor right away.
Although, interestingly, our friend Sam Bendet, who covered drone matters quite a lot, as his profession, he's some of the stories he's pushed forward include claims about how they have created their own firmware, that they can flash, that have a bunch of features to them, like instead of landing, if they lose connection, they instead go up, like up instead of down. The idea being they can go up to get out of jamming range and possibly reconnect to the base station, whereas if they land, then they'll likely be lost. I wonder if in flashing the firmware of these devices, they could change the rules about displaying GPS and things on screen, which would, I'll just take Nuke's comment and then we'll let you keep going.
Yeah, I was wondering, like we were saying with the video being intercepted, have you seen any, we've seen pretty widely the use of flashed firmware, and that was mainly, I believe, on most of the DJI devices. I didn't know if you had seen any obvious attempts at obfuscating video or anything like that with trying to think about how I want to say this without getting into too many technical difficult details, but have you seen any instances of them changing the video format to a way to where these little handheld devices won't see it?
Okay, let me back up just a bit here. So there's kind of like two classes of drones here. There's sort of these hobby drones that are assembled from components sourced individually from China, and so these are all deliberately open software, unencrypted devices from a variety of different manufacturers, most of which probably people have never heard of before. Then there's the drones from DJI and Autel. So the drones from the DJI and Autel, those actually use encryption for sure. And those drones tend to be more expensive, and they have much better cameras on them and so forth. So I would think those are used more for reconnaissance. You wouldn't just strap a bomb on the bottom and go blow them up, because they're a little bit precious and hard to get, is my feeling. So the ones that are used for the bomb strapped on the bottom tend to be the more expensive ones. Yes, the firmware has been flashed on those machines to kind of work around the countermeasures. And I'm going to guess that's probably fairly successful. But on the really cheap ones that they're blowing up, making a lot of them smashing into things, that's harder. The video is never meant for that. You might see that happening. And of course, it's always hard to predict the future. There's nothing really obviously sitting there that says, yeah, do this. And certainly they could move to a digital video system. Those tend to be a lot more money. Kind of wondering about the cost effectiveness of these devices. Like for today, I actually priced one out. In Canada, you could build one of those drones like the Russians are flying around for $650 Canadian, so whatever that is, $500 US, something like that. So if you say, okay, I'm gonna increase that by $200 with a fancier camera or system, Does that change the economics of the whole thing? I don't know, because they'll still be able to jam the control signals. So I just don't know which way that's going to go. I do expect to see more electronic countermeasures, though. There was a video shown by the FPV folks showing that the Russians jammed the video stream of the Ukrainian drone, which would be real easy to do. Interesting comment by the Ukrainians, though, is they are perfectly happy when the Russians do that, because it means they can't fly their own drones either.
Interesting. Well, I guess that might depend on the tactical situation, whether the Ukrainians think they have the upper hand or not in the drone battle. But I guess if they know the jamming's up, then they know they'll have some time to focus on other things.
Can I
like prepping? Yeah, of course.
I had one more comment here. I see you got a question. I have one more comment. I did actually see a comment in a Russian Telegram channel where someone said, one of the Russians asked, how could they gain technical superiority in this drone battle? And the comment back was, how was that even possible when both sides are using exactly the same stuff? They can't. It's just, they're exactly the same components on both sides.
Yeah, I suppose on that front, the battle might be in the operating software, and just to get little edges here and there. So we'll go to nukes, and then I have a question or two for you, Daniel, about that second thread that you wrote. So go ahead, nukes.
So specifically on that last question, it's been talked about. I just didn't want to get too technical the first time, but it seems like we're going down this path. So there were a lot of reports that came out, trying to think when it was. It was probably very beginning of summer or just before that, so like June, maybe May, that the Russians specifically were using 1030 and 1090 megahertz, so the ADS-B, Mode-S, interrogation, aviation frequencies for secondary surveillance radar and so on. But what they were doing apparently was changing the 1.2 gig video transmitters onto those bands, knowing that Ukraine wouldn't jam them due to the wider potential for causing interference to civil aviation and such, even though it's probably not a big issue, as there's not a lot of civil aviation going on. I just didn't know if you'd heard any details like that.
Not with the video. I seen it with the control signals, and I'll probably do some more threads on that, where they're using the LoRa, mostly it's expressed LRS and LoRa. Sorry to be so technical, and you can kind of shift the frequency bands around on that. So there's a bit of cat and mouse going on there. But I know it's interesting to watch this unfold and realize it's just all hobby stuff.
Yeah, it is pretty amazing. And we don't mind getting into the technical, as long as we dive in for a few minutes, then we come back out. Sometimes it exposes people to concepts they're not familiar with, which is kind of the point, so that everybody can learn. So in that second thread that you wrote, it's the second item in the nest. You then talk about their ability to upgrade for resistance as against electronic warfare. Do you have any thoughts on what that would require? And sort of what the availability of parts that can do that would be?
Yes. I think this is one of those times when we're talking about this sort of stuff where we have to ask ourselves, do we really want to say this out loud? If you know what I mean.
Yeah, are you suggesting for operational security reasons, like as in there's no point in advertising it?
Yes, like I have my ideas that I said, okay, do you really want to just say this out loud? They probably know, but
yeah, sure.
There's a bunch of stuff they can do, and they are doing, but I'll leave it at that, maybe.
Sure, we'll happy to let everybody make their own OPSEC decisions. we may come back to it down the road in future conversations. Potentially, if we start to see evidence of those techniques being used in particular, because then we'll know that the cat is out of the bag. Go ahead, Nukes.
Specifically on the Russian side, and I'm not really worried about their OPSEC, but with the Shahed 136 and 131, that they're using some pretty advanced software-defined radios. They've actually implemented mainly a jam-resistant GPS GNSS receiver with those. But it's the same system I would assume is going to be used. As prolific as those chipsets are, there's no doubt in my mind that those are in use or going to be in use. And those things aren't even really restricted, a lot of them. So I assume we'll see them on both sides at some point. And this is something that's been published enough that there's probably not much of an OPSEC. And so just want to throw my 2 cents in there.
Okay, I'll comment. To be honest, I've been focusing on this smaller or lower end of the drone world, because that's basically closer to home, and I understand it. I think it's you got to understand how the things are being used. It's sort of like they're not like a cheap, Predator drone or something. They're more like a fancy rocket propelled grenade is how they're being used. It's sort of like that. So they're flown purely visual, and they're not flown very far or very high. And so I think that's, if you think of them like that, so okay, basically I'm just a fancy grenade or something, or a cheap anti-tank rocket. That will give you the idea of what people are thinking. And I don't know what to say. That's sort of my take on it anyways, at least at the moment. It'll probably change by tomorrow, but we'll see.
Okay. Well, Nukes, did you want to add something in?
I just had another question. So on these FPV drones, are they using some sort of autopilot controller IMU type system, or are they purely hand controlling these things?
It is variable on how you can configure these things. It is mostly hand controlled. Like there's no GPS on there. There's a barometer and probably some inertial guidance on the thing. But and they'll probably play around with that a little bit. But it's hard to tell exactly what they can do with it. I'm not expecting anything really fancy out of these things. I think they just strap a bomb on the bottom and fly them into the side of a truck. And that's pretty much all there is to it.
We saw a video come out just a few days ago where one of the drones had some forks, cutlery attached to the front. I don't know if you saw that one. But clearly they're focused on getting the job done. Okay, well, so Daniel, thank you very much. And we wanted to let you speak to those threads because I think it's a great example of somebody who's into a hobby. And we know that there are several related hobbies, right? Like essentially the flight trackers and ship trackers among us, they're like hobbies, ham radio, drone work, all of those things can give you insight into what is happening in the war. And so Daniel taking his experience with, building these drones and then saying, hey, I'm seeing news developments in Telegram. I have some insight into that based on my experience. And then writing threads up is exactly the sort of thing that we like to promote. So, Daniel, thanks for coming up. Hopefully you'll keep dropping by and we'll keep an eye out for future threads that you might write. And, we'll try and highlight your good work.
Great. Thank you very much.
So thanks again. And moving into the next example, a good example of work from the last week. I thought a cool one to highlight was actually some work that Radio and Nukes did. So I've put those threads up in the nest, and you'll see that the first one is a longer sort of personal explanation of what happened, where Nukes got these transmissions that he captured on his radio. And you'll see that what resulted from that in the second tweet is after initially telling his story, it was cool enough that it caught the attention of some journalists. And so he was then interviewed by Vice News to discuss what he found. And the Vice News article is now the second tweet in the nest. But Nukes, did you want to tell us about what you got up to?
Yeah, so this one goes way back. I think it was 2017. It was the height of the Little Rocket Man drama, the nuclear test in North Korea, and then the ICBM test that followed. I happen to live in an area not too far away from where the B-2s are based and where Whiteman Air Force Base is. So we see them quite a bit here. It's not unusual in any respect to see B-2s fly over. Until they were grounded, it was kind of a weekly occurrence, and now they're back again. But happened to be sitting out on the back porch at my old house with my wife, and one flew over pretty low. We usually see them more up towards 20-some thousand feet, and this one came over about 10,000 feet, 10 or 12,000. And B-2s are big, so when they come over that low, they're loud, and they are... have a little bit of a different sound, and they're very noticeable. I mean, this one went directly over us, and then, so interesting. And then, I don't know, a minute and a half, 2 minutes later, a second one, and then a third one. So I ran in and grabbed the cheapo Radio Shack handheld scanner that I tend to use as my go-to. And, these frequencies are well published. They're all over Radio Reference. The air-to-ground frequencies as well as the air-to-air frequencies are known. For most of these units over the continental U.S., just because so many people listen. And turned on the radio and, heard the standard air traffic control traffic, and then picked up an air-to-air frequency, and all of a sudden it was like, oh, well, there's an exercise going on, so let's listen for a minute. And, we've heard some exercises over Missouri before, but they're usually more... kind of like task-oriented, we're going to go out and we're going to task some bomb target, and we're going to practice the information sharing or something, versus like an all-encompassing, like immersion type exercise where they were actually up and, targeting actual objects on the ground. They didn't release any weapons, of course. But not only that, we had E-3s, there was a B-52, a C-130, and some other planes that I don't even know what they were. Never saw them on ADSB, only heard them on the radio and heard some call signs. So it turned out to be quite the exercise. And like the first thing we heard is an immediate tasking from a airborne control aircraft saying, hey, we've got a possible DPRK VIP in a building, and here's your tasking order. So that right there about jumped out of my chair and said, well, this is pretty obvious what we're doing here and what's happening. And so I recorded most of it, not all of it. The recording that you'll find in that tweet and on the Vice article is actually probably something like 5 hours of exercise time, 4 or 5 hours of exercise time. The dead spaces have been removed, so when they're not talking on the radio all the time. So it went on for 3 nights, and I didn't really feel like releasing the entire thing back in 2017 because it just seemed very operationally important at the time. I don't really think there's a major OPSEC issue there because the brevity codes that they use and the way they do radio traffic, that's all well known. That's very standard amongst U.S. military. Just the fact that they were practicing for this alone was interesting, but again, that's something you would do as a nation when you have a threat, so nothing super secure. So I released a small chunk of it to the aviationist, David Sincotti, I believe his name is, and he published it back in 2017, and I was not really into the OSINT and all of the things that I'm into now, and got a bunch of requests for, national news, this and that then, and I just turned them all down because I just didn't want to release anymore. Well, I was actually talking with the Area 51, the new Area 51, last week sometime about that recording, and it just sort of jarred my memory and said, hey, so I said, it's been 6 years. Why don't I go ahead and post it? So I put it out there, and, Vice DM'd me, and we had a nice little chat, and it was a good little interview, and I think he did a really good job on the story. It came out well, and if you want to listen to the recording, it's all there. Again, with this stuff, the barrier to entry is very low. You can buy a $20 scanner on eBay and listen to these things yourself. If the military didn't want us to hear that or wanted to obscure those communications, there's no reason they couldn't have. The B-2s certainly have encrypted comm systems, SATCOM, Link 16, HavQuick. There's all these different systems that they can use. So a lot of times with exercises, you will see them transmit in the clear. So just so safety issues, so that everybody can hear everything. If somebody gets too close, they've got an open frequency without any sort of complicated word of the day or whatever they have to enter for their crypto, their ComSec. But while it was unusual and it was interesting that they used Missouri, because most of these exercises tend to happen in the warning areas off the coast, or Nevada, China Lake, somewhere down there where you don't get a chance to. You can listen, but they've got a lot more standard ways to do the ComSec, I guess, and this, that, and the other. So this one was interesting. But if you have a look at the Missouri Ozarks and you have a look at North Korea on a topographic map, you'll see why they were using that area. The terrain's similar, the trees are similar. It's just a very similar location.
So while it's easy enough to, if you have a radio to pick up the transmission, you were set up so that you could record. And it was a little bit of luck combining the fact that you could recognize that it was an interesting event, and that interesting event happened to be close enough to you that you could capture it. So, it's a lot sort of that meeting between skill and luck, which is fortuitous. I like this story because I appreciated how you reached out to some media. And that's something I've been encouraging a couple of friends of ours to do is, hey, if you develop some really interesting insight, people want to learn about it, and it can build relationships with some of these folks where you build a back and a forth, because you might have other interesting stories in the future, and it can kind of flow both ways, because sometimes if you've, demonstrated some expertise, they may have a story that comes to them where they need additional insight or comment, and you might slowly build a relationship where you can be adding to their work, on an ongoing basis. So hopefully we can get a couple more of our friends working in that direction. Exit, go ahead.
So I have a note and a question. The note is, I think your wife must be the coolest person ever, because you do things like record radio from the porch in the middle of the night, and I think she must be pretty cool to put up with all that and all the other things that you follow. And then secondly, my question is, you talked in the interview about it being on open comms. You just talked about it now. Can those things be interfered with the other way, as in people can speak into that communication line and kind of interrupt the flow of information back and forth? Or is it really shut down and just the listening part is plausible?
Now, first off, my wife's awesome. She puts up with a lot of strange technical nerd stuff that happens. I had antennas everywhere that night because we were in the middle of trying to move some stuff, and my normal stuff wasn't set up. So it was a mad dash to hook everything back up. But anyway, yeah. As far as interfering, certainly you could do that. That's a good way to have a knock on the door and a trip to a prison. In the U.S. anyway, they take that extremely seriously. So don't do it. It is certainly possible. However, the sheer size of the military aviation band, it's huge. And so they always, every time you fly a plane, you typically have a primary and a backup and guard. So there's guard is like your emergency channel. So those planes have got radios sitting on multiple frequencies. So if somebody was sitting there and just blatantly jamming this one frequency, they would just switch to another one and talk. The other thing is that, you know, you've got two planes up in the air that aren't very far apart, and they've got very good line of sight. Unless you've got some sophisticated, high-powered equipment on the ground, you're really not going to cause any issues, major issues. They would still be able to talk, just surely overpowering it. But, I mean, it certainly could happen. I don't think, other than the fact that they would get up in arms about it and show up at your door, more than likely, especially if you did it for any amount of time, it probably wouldn't cause any major issues. But hopefully that just doesn't happen, because, you know, that's part of the reason why I didn't want to release this for as long as I did and kind of sat on it, is that I don't really like getting too deep in the U.S. system. I mean, I live here. That's my military. We pay for it, and they've got a job to do, and I don't need to get in the way of it. So that is another thing. So I much prefer posting intercepts of Russian communications.
Very briefly, just to Exit's question, for those who don't know, in order to transmit, to speak to them at all, you need a radio operator's license. And part of the reason that licenses are required are so that you don't intentionally or accidentally broadcast on frequencies that are dedicated for other purposes, whether, you know, commercial, like broadcast, or military. And, you know, that's one of the main things they teach you, is where not to broadcast, like in which frequencies. And if you do broadcast, for when Nuke says they'll show up at your door, if you broadcast on those prohibited frequencies for any appreciable amount of time where you're causing interference, as in you're occupying air time, that may prevent them from speaking on the frequency they prefer, they can triangulate your transmission. So, I mean, if you do it very briefly, it might be hard for them to find you, but if you do it for any length of time, they probably will come. So anyway, Nukes, go ahead.
So one other thing, since you mentioned that, another reason why exercises sometimes don't use ComSec, specifically frequency hopping over the continental U.S., is exactly what you mentioned. It's a little different, a little more nuanced. But so if you want to jam a radio signal, you typically have to overpower it. But when you want to overpower something, you have to narrow your bandwidth down to really get the power density you need to overwhelm it. You can't just jam the whole military aviation band. It's way too much bandwidth. It's kind of like trying to take a flashlight and light up a whole stadium with it versus making a little spot beam in an area, or, you know, a laser versus a floodlight. Similar, it's a little different, but anyway, when you do, the way the military tends to get around jamming is doing something called frequency hopping, to where your radio moves, you know, it can be thousands of times a second. It changes in frequency. So if somebody was going to jam, they would either have to jam the entire band, which is not really possible because you spread your power out too far, or they would have to know where you're going to hop to. And of course, they use a cryptological random number generators, and everybody's on the same page. Everybody hops around at the same time. But over the continental U.S., it gets a little tough because you have to exclude where your radio hops, or you're going to cause malicious, well, not necessarily malicious, but harmful interference to, you know, any other number of military users. If you hop outside of the military-specific bands, you might cause problem with police, fire, EMS. Now, it should be a pretty small problem because it only hops there once, you know, for a tiny little bit of time over a short period. But, you know, if you get enough of that going on, or if it's something super important, those hops can become a problem. So that is one of the reasons why you don't see the frequency hopping used as much over the continental U.S. is just because they have to exclude all of these important frequencies, and it just becomes a big lookup table task that has to be loaded into the radios, and it's just a pain. So that is a little bit of the reason why you tend to see a lot of things in the clear. Now, they certainly have ways to to do this encrypted, and they will use this stuff over the U.S. It just requires more planning and more of a deconfliction.
Okay, it looks like we have 2 more comments from, I know, some radio operators. So we'll go to Paul, then we'll go to Brandon, and then we'll keep going with updates.
Yeah, that reminds me of an incident that happened at a company I used to work for. We tested the UHF antennas that were on like F-16s, and most of the aircraft have the same like shark fin type antenna on it, but they're usually dual band, L band, and UHF, and we had a 20-foot by 20 room,
Hey, Paul. So I'm sorry to interrupt you, Paul.
Stop.
But
completely shut.
Hey, Paul. So sorry, I muted you.
From base, giving us at certain.
Sorry, Paul. I think there may have been some sort of a delay in your audio that was causing some gapping out. We weren't hearing what you were saying very clearly. We heard up to about the part about the shark fin antennas on the F-16s. But you give it one more shot, but you might want to just actually cycle down or leave the space, come back, and we'll bring you back up. Okay. We'll bring you up in a moment. Brandon, go ahead.
Thanks. Mic check. Can you hear me okay, Michael?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, it strikes me what Radio Nick's just talking about as far as like electronic warfare and jamming. I work in cellular LTE-NR, outdoor-indoor deployments, and one of my customers has a big distribution facility just off the basically, I guess, north runway of Nellis outside of Vegas. And about every 6 months, their Ford key fobs, everybody who owns a Ford, their key fobs get blanked because a pilot forgets to, when they're doing their ground check before takeoff, sometimes they flip an EW system on. And when they fly over the building, it wipes all of their car key fobs and they can't start their cars. And I know there's another big incident everybody knows about when AWACS took off, and it was, Dish was on, and it like wiped everybody's garage door openers and a bunch of, again, Ford key fobs because the frequencies that it work on. So yeah, they don't really like to do it over the U.S. too much, and there are consequences if you end up with military radio equipment. One of the first missions when I was in Civil Air Patrol that I was on, somebody had bought what they thought was this cool thing at a military surplus store, but it was in fact an ELT that had been stolen off of a C-130, and they had it on their desk in Gloucester, Mass, right at the harbor, and we had a nor'easter, and something blew in the window and knocked it off the table, and it was still active and it was still assigned to an aircraft. And so I got picked up along with, about 30 other cadets and a whole bunch of Mass Emergency Management Agency personnel and the Coast Guard to go triangulate where this C-130 went down. So yeah, that stuff's controlled for a reason.
Pretty wild stories. As soon as you said key fob, I knew where that was heading. So it's always cool that we have, people who do this on a day-to-day basis join us. Okay, I see Exit's hand went back down. But Paul, you're back with us. Paul, we had heard you up to the point where you talked about the testing the F-16 radios, and you were starting to talk about a 20 by 20 antenna, I think.
No, it was we were testing the shark fin antennas that are on the aircraft. Different. Sometimes the same antennas on various aircraft. You can on F-16 to C-130 to A-10. It's pretty. It's like a standard model. It's a little short shark fin. It's usually a dual band L band and UHF. And are you still? Am I still coming through? Okay.
Yeah, you sound great now.
Oh, okay, good. So, anyways, the base wanted us to test these antennas because they occasionally have radio problems, and they'll recable and stuff like that. And one of the things is they'll send the antenna out for testing. And where the shop I used to work at had a 20-foot by 20-foot by 20-foot cage, basically a Faraday cage that we tested in. And the finger stock just happened to be bad at the door of the cage, even though it had a good interlock system. For some reason, that we were close enough to the base to where there was enough signal that was actually making it out to the tower, and that was like 3 miles away. But it didn't take much. But they found us within like an hour and a half, and this was usually takes like a couple minutes just to test the various, go through the antenna testing cycle. And we had like, they would save up for maybe 20 or 30 antennas that would just go into a pile, and then we just recertify them. So it didn't take long, and we had the transmitters. We had to test at the. Of course, we had to test at the power levels that was required, and there's a TO book that tells everything, all the antennas that have to be tested, what their SWR is, and everything else. And we had all the forms to fill out, and had to write down the SWR of each, part of the band in the UHF spectrum, plus the part of the band in the L band, which was used for TACAN and the regular transponder. And so it's like they found us in a matter of hours, and it was just all I did was send 2 planes up, and that was all it took. And they triangulated like it took them longer to get to our company than it did for them to find where we were.
Yeah, and I know that certainly amateur radio operators, for fun, will practice fox hunts or triangulation exercises. And so if amateurs can do it quickly, think how much faster the authorities can do it if they think you're interfering with their work. So anyway, guys, thanks.
And another thing too is that the UHF aircraft band is military use only, pretty much. And like locally here at the Davis Mountain will broadcast on, I should say, the Tucson Tower for the regular civilian aircraft for Tucson International Airport will broadcast on a corresponding UHF frequency simulcast. So the local base, which is a couple miles to the east, will know where the commercial aircraft are at the same time. So there's simulcasts on several frequencies, but it's a very unique setup, the way things go, and it's but UHF though is the really particular because that's military only, pretty much, and those bands. So they're real sensitive about that, and they, if this was on the regular aircraft frequency, like 118.3 or something like that, it usually takes them they have to call out the FAA to go find the trouble. The FAA has to go authorize and do a search, whereas the military, they got free reign. Just boom, they're federal. They just go right for you. Okay, let you go.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, and all these conflictions between the various channels and procedures have been worked out over decades and decades. So it's all, I know it sounds pretty complicated, but it's a pretty well-oiled machine in terms of how it's supposed to work. Whether that always happens as per Brandon's story, that's a different question. So we spent a little while kind of nerding out there. So thanks for bearing with us. Kind of the upshot was to take the stories of Radio and Nukes and the stories of Daniel. So whereas Daniel has just gotten into writing threads based on his passion, Radio and Nukes has been at it for a while, and he's now developing relationships with reporters. And just to say, hey, you guys can do this too. If you have an area of expertise, start generating some content, right? Like, believe it or not, you may know more than a huge portion of the population, and you can add to the conversation. So I encourage you guys to work on that. Two last points on good examples, and then we'll quickly get into updates on the offensive. The last points are the first and second items in the nest. The first is the tweet by Benjamin Strick. A good example. In this case, Ben works with the Center for Information Resilience, and they've been working away over months now in order to identify the units that were involved in atrocities in the city of Izium while Russia occupied them, and that are associated with mass graves in that city. And so they've figured out the unit and some of the named individuals. So if you want to see how some of the work that they did in order to discover those things and their results, check out the thread from Benjamin. The second item, just as another example, about a week and a half ago, I highlighted a report from Human Rights Watch about violence along the, I believe it's the Saudi-Yemen border, and in particular against some immigrants from Ethiopia and other countries. Now, a new article, in addition to the Human Rights Watch report, a new article has now been put out by one of the researchers who worked on it, talking about his process, having to work through the imagery of the violence, the mass killings. And so, it's tough stuff, but to the extent that you may want to work on trying to investigate and uncover stories like this, hearing how others go about it, I'm sure can be helpful. Okay. I think with that, we'll move into updates on the war. We'll start, as usual, with the offensive. Just a reminder that we don't aim to track developments on the front line in minute detail. There are great accounts who do that already, and they generally produce some maps. And so if you have a look at the third item in the nest, that's the tweet where I put out a collection of the maps from the best accounts who do this work. So, for example, today it's the Institute for the Study of War, War Mapper, Andrew Perpetua, DEFMON, Project Owl, Poulet Volant, GeoConfirmed. I've included a weather update from David Helms, who is continuing to do it basically every day, which is great. And because that's an important part of understanding the offensive. And if you want deeper insight, for example, Andrew Perpetua will do live streams where he puts his map on screen share on a YouTube stream, and then he'll walk through the map on screen and he'll describe the latest changes. He does those twice a week on Tuesday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and then on Friday afternoons at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. So obviously he'll be doing it tomorrow, and you can always check his live stream out for lots of great detail. So our goal is really just to do an overview in case you may not have heard where things are at on various fronts. We're not covering it in huge detail. We're just essentially trying to speak to the general direction and hopefully get a sense of where things may head in the next week or so. I'm going to move, I think, from the west to the east because most of the focus is on the southern front in Zaporizhia, which is generally the westernmost area. So starting from the fourth item back in the nest, you'll see that's a tweet from Dmitry of War Translated, and he's passing along some complaints from Russian VDV, or paratroopers, who are fighting in the Robotin-Verbov area. And interestingly, they're saying that they're having a really hard time because of Ukrainian airstrikes, and particularly the use of cluster munitions by the Ukrainians, essentially saying they're being hit every day, and being worn down. Obviously, there's been lots of discussion about how it's possible that with sort of an overwhelming excess of Air Force power, the Russians haven't been able to deny the sky to the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians are doing an incredible job, and their Air Force and these cluster munitions are contributing on that front. And you'll see with the fifth item back in the nest, tweet from Misfit, who's a friend of ours, just translating some Ukrainian origin updates, essentially saying progress on that Robotin-Verbov front is continuing slowly but steadily, more or less in all directions. And we've had discussions over the last 2 weeks about the impact of terrain in that area, because it is not completely flat. And the suggestion is that the Ukrainians may be fighting to try to take the dominant heights, as opposed to necessarily heading directly for the villages and towns themselves. So it sounds like, again, slow but steady on that front. And of course, if anybody has any more recent updates, because some of these are a day or two old, you're welcome to come up, although we're not too concerned about the very latest breaking news, because it's often hard to confirm. Moving a little further to the east along the Zaporizhia line, you'll see the sixth item in the nest, tweet from Shashank Joshi. There is an article from the New York Times that he's passing along, which includes a discussion about how, just to the east from the Robotin-Verbov axis, there's this other push that's working down toward Storon-Lenivka. And interesting detail in this New York Times article, again, the Ukrainians are optimistic that if they can break through the defenses that they're working on now, they believe that minefields will become less and less dense as they progress further down the road, which will give them greater options, potentially the ability to move faster. All of which, concepts we've discussed before, but again, it makes the Ukrainians who are fighting themselves optimistic. The seventh item back is a report from Euromaidan Press. We had a bit of a discussion on, I think it was Sunday, where Andrew Perpetua described to us some of the defensive structures south of Optin, saying that the village itself is actually quite small and wouldn't really support much of a fighting force within it. And he described several hills. I'm not sure if I'll remember all three names, but there was, what was it? There was the Cuckoo, the Anthill, and what was it? The Slab? In any event, that are major defensive points just south of that city, between it and Donetsk City Airport. And so, those will be challenging areas for Ukraine to advance in. However, in this tweet, Euromaidan Press is reporting that it appears the Russian defenses in that area are faltering, allowing the Ukrainians to advance in several directions. But again, this was from 2 days ago. I'm not hearing about major breakthroughs there. So it, once again, it may be the Ukrainians are making progress, but not reaching the point of breakthrough. Continuing further to the east, the next item back in the nest, I think, seventh or eighth, is a tweet from Jeff, who does great work tracking equipment deliveries. In this case, he is posting on a progress along the front just to correct the record, because I believe it was Hannah Malyar, who is a spokesperson for the Ukrainian military, had come out and said that the Ukrainians had made great success and more or less taken the cities of Klishivka and Andriivka, which are on the flanks of Bakhmut. But then, interestingly, accounts for some of the forces that are actually fighting there came out right away and said, no, we haven't yet liberated them. There's still significant ongoing fighting. So that was a bit of, a brief embarrassment. But it does sound like they are making progress. However, the fighting remains heavy. And then moving up further into the northern Donetsk, Luhansk area, you can see in this, it's way back in the nest. What is it? The 9th item, again, from Shashank Joshi, passing along an article from the Wall Street Journal that's discussing fighting in the Kupiansk area. And we've talked about that sort of Svetov down to Liman and Kupiansk, how the Russians are pressing there in an attempt to draw the Ukrainian defenders away from the Ukrainian fighters away from Zaporizhia in order to defend in this region. But the reports in this Wall Street Journal article are that really the Russian offensive there has stalled and is not making a lot of progress. So it sounds like it sounds like the Ukrainian defense there has remained fairly stout. The next set of material that I'm hoping to speak to is looking at some deep strikes that have occurred recently. So the first of these is about the strike yesterday in Yevpatoria in Crimea. So these should appear in the front of the nest in just a moment. And this is just an example. It's fairly interesting, and there was a decent amount of OSINT work done in connection with it, so I thought I'd highlight this one, but there are several other strikes just in the last few days that I'll mention briefly. So you'll see the first item that should pop up in just a moment is the tweet from Timothy Mylovnov, and his is sort of an overview thread about the strike and how reportedly it disabled Russian S-400 Triumph air defense system. Now, there are 1 or 2 points in his thread you maybe don't want to pay as close attention to. He cites the $1.2 billion cost figure, which I understand is sort of the exaggerated at the very highest possible end. But still, taking out one of these systems is very significant. So Timothy's tweet, that first in the nest, has the overview if you want some details on it. The second item in the nest I thought was kind of cool as a geolocation. Occasionally, when one geolocation isn't sufficient to directly identify a place, what you'll see is some of the good accounts, they'll geolocate multiple pieces of footage, and then they'll look at the perspective that the image or video is taken from, and then they'll try and see if they can get those perspective lines to cross for an idea of what they're all looking at the same time. And interestingly, sometimes that works out beautifully, and the crossed lines will fall right on the location. In this case, because the air defense system was way out, sort of in the country, and most of the footage was filmed from the nearby village, it was quite a distance away, and they were all looking in almost the same direction. So I just thought it was an interesting example where using that perspective, it tells you the direction and the sense that it is distant, but it doesn't allow the lines to cross just because you don't have enough precision. So I thought that was an interesting one where OSINT Technical had geolocated 3 different views and still wasn't able to pin it precisely down. Ultimately, I think a bunch of folks figured out what it was because the location of this air defense system was previously known. And I believe this was one of the systems where some tourists had actually taken some vacation photos right near it and published them, which those tourists were actually brought in and made to do apology videos. But because it was known to be in the region where all these views were looking, people were able to figure out what the object of the strike was, even before the satellite battle damage assessments came in. Speaking of which, the third item in the nest is from Brady Afric. He's one of a couple of people who got some quite good satellite imagery in which you can see he does up a GIF here that shows the destruction of the system. Actually, I know in some back chats, people have been saying, don't highlight that it's a system that was destroyed. I believe it was 1 or 2 launchers that are part of the system. But you can see in the satellite imagery the destruction of the launchers. Because obviously a system can be several launchers and radar and command all working together. But this is a fairly high value target. The the fourth tweet in the nest was an interesting point to me. As with several of the strikes that we'll discuss today, there were claims that this may have been a mixed attack that may have relied on drones and some missiles at the same time in an effort to overwhelm air defenses. And you'll see in the fourth tweet from Kherson Cat that some video was released by the Ukrainians of the claimed drone that was used in the strike. And apparently it's not a known model. It may be a brand new model. Since then, people may have identified it, but as of early this morning, it sounded like it was new. Yep, that was it. So Exit, go ahead.
So I actually had a question for Nukes on this one, because we have seen a number of people make the relationship between this strike and the strikes in Sevastopol, saying that these were enabled because of the liberation of the Boyko Towers in the middle of the Black Sea. And the Ukrainians taking down some radar installations there and an EW system, etc. Do we have enough evidence to actually prove that right now?
Personally, I don't. It seems pretty likely that they were using those towers for some kind of operational outpost, radar system, whatever you want to call it. And I know there were some images showing retrieved EW systems on one of the small boats that was, I don't remember if it was leaving that tower, if it was leaving the actual Crimean coast, but it certainly seems plausible. I can't verify it at this point.
And so many of these events are intertwined. So when I prepare my speaking notes, I'm trying to build a narrative, so I separate items in the offensive and then items in the Black Sea. So we will get to, in a few minutes, developments in the Black Sea, and more specifically, the Ukrainian occupation of the Boyko towers, which are those drilling rigs. And we'll talk about potentially their role in the strike on Sevastopol as well. But I wanted to point out this strike in Yevpatoria because it includes several things, potentially a new drone, lots of great OSINT work in terms of geolocating the footage, looking at the battle damage, the fact that it's a significant target, and that it does contribute to the overall strategy of the Ukrainians in destroying Russian air defense systems, apparently is shaping for, to make subsequent attacks that much easier. So continuing on this idea of deep strikes, just in the last few days, this isn't even a comprehensive examination, but there was the Yevpatoria strike, and then there was, you'll see the first item in the nest is a discussion of an attack on a research plant in Tver. In the second item in the nest, you'll see that there was also an explosion that is claimed to have been of a gas pipeline in Saratov. And so there's lots of infrastructure attacks that are ongoing. And because there are some high profile ones like the Sevastopol strike, some of these others get lost. But I just want to highlight that, there is a lot ongoing, and it seems like the pace and potentially even the sophistication of the strikes in terms of tactics by, some of them using apparently multiple drones or drones and missiles seems to be increasing. To that end, the third item in the nest includes a link to an article on how Ukraine's deep battle is now preparing the ground for success. So it's put together by the, the International Institute for Security Studies, the IISS. I can't recall its acronym. But if you'd like to read that report, it does go into an examination of deep strikes and the impact that they're having slowly wearing away at the sort of deep Russian logistics. And just one moment. My last point before going to hands, the fourth item in the nest is, together with this idea of the slow but steady success of the Ukrainian deep strike program, that fourth item is a tweet from our friend Intel Schizo, who caught as an interesting detail that the Russians have apparently brought in several diesel locomotives that they're basing in Mariupol. And interestingly, it seems like the intention is not that they would run the rail line back and forth, but that they will be taking supplies from the port in Mariupol, out to distribution points. And so it's sort of this combined, apparently, cargo ship to diesel train chain that they're trying to develop, which may suggest they're doing it because of concern about the longer logistics chains, and they need some, more alternatives, partly because those logistics chains are under threat from the deep strikes. Go ahead, Exit.
I was just going to say the IISS.org, they have a Twitter account here. I don't see anything specifically from them right now, but they've been putting out some really great content lately, and I highly recommend following them because their content really doesn't get a whole bunch of traction. It doesn't get a lot of tweets and things, but it's really good quality content, and I would recommend them. I think we've lost Mr. Bond, or is that me?
You're fine.
Well, that's good. So I will take a quick moment then to do some housekeeping, because we haven't done that yet tonight. If you are new here, there's that little space up above our heads that's called the nest. And so all the resources we talk about, they are up there and you can click through them. Once we take them out of the nest, they will be shared to the tweet, the space tweet, which you can find in the bottom right-hand corner. And Jacoby's been sharing everything down there. So you might want to bookmark that tweet so that you can look back and find your resources really easily. You can also share that out if you want to bring other people in to come listen to us. And then or join the conversation, which would be even better. And then in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen is a little request mic button. You can click on that and we'll take a boo and bring you up.
Yeah, thanks for that. Sorry for dropping out for a moment there. I'm reset now. Okay, the next set of material should just be populating up into the nest at the moment. The first of which is an article from New Voice of Ukraine. So this is discussing sort of the balance of forces in Ukraine. I like to look at some of the work done every couple of days, evaluating overall success failure and some numbers. So this first item in the nest was an interview where New Voice of Ukraine apparently spoke with Budanov, the military intelligence head, and he emphasized that in the fall, the intention is that the Ukrainian offensive will continue, but it will have to be predominantly infantry-based. There has been some discussion, we've had it here, about how the changing weather will affect the ability to continue the offensive, given some more restrictive movement for vehicles. But Budanov seems confident that Ukraine can proceed, with a focus on infantry. The second item in the nest is passing along from some numbers that were presented by Ukrainian intelligence on Telegram. And I find this interesting. This is the Ukrainian claims about the number of Russian forces that are currently deployed in fighting in Ukraine, including 420,000 personnel, just over 2,000 tanks, 3,000 artillery systems, 360 planes. So my understanding is that's not the entirety, right, of the Russian forces, but that because of the incredible Russian losses, slowly but surely a higher and higher proportion of total Russian equipment has been dedicated to Ukraine. But looking at those numbers, it does seem like the Ukrainians believe the Russians are holding overall force structure fairly steady, even if the quality may be degrading in terms of level of training of personnel, or many of these artillery guns would have their barrels wearing down, those sorts of things. So the numbers don't tell the whole story, but I still think that it's interesting to pay attention to. The third item in the nest links to one of those overview thought pieces on how would you even evaluate the degree of success of the Ukrainian offensive. And so this was written by not Mark Hertling, but Mick Ryan, who is a retired Australian general who writes some thoughtful analysis. And it's an article on his Substack, and he breaks down 7 criteria looking at how Ukraine's doing. I don't think off the top of my head I can remember all 7, but it included, did they accomplish the element of surprise? Are they wearing away at Russian logistics? Are they wearing away at attriting Russian forces? Are they capturing territory? Is the offensive being interpreted by Ukraine's Western allies as a success or a failure? And he goes through each of these criteria that he sets out to, judge where he thinks Ukraine is standing at the moment. And he's optimistic and he's hopeful. He does highlight several areas where the offensive hasn't yet met the goals to declare it a success. But I thought it was a fairly balanced evaluation of how things are going. So you might click over to his Substack and read that. He often will turn these sorts of things into like a longer thread that he publishes here on Twitter, but sometimes it takes him a few days to do that. Anyway, I thought they were pretty thoughtful criteria. The fourth item in the nest, sort of in a similar vein to evaluating the offensive overall, is a tweet from Shashank Joshi. He's the defense editor at The Economist. So he wrote an article of his own evaluating whether Ukrainian tactics are working. And similarly, he gives, a mixed analysis, essentially saying that the Ukrainians' chosen tactics are keeping infantry losses down, but that the officials that he's spoken with still don't see enough evidence to, say that Russian attrition will definitely enable a breakthrough. So Joshi actually also wrote his thoughts in response to Mick Ryan's Substack thread. So, reading those together, I thought were interesting. But I'd like to provide overviews of some of these folks who are looking at the big picture. Okay, last point on the some developments in connection with the offensive before we get into a bunch of news that happened in connection with the Black Sea. And so the first of these is, we just talked about some evaluations of Ukrainian progress. And so the first item that should populate in the nest is a tweet from Noel Reports. And he's passing along a Russian video, just making sure it's actually come up for you guys. Yeah. So he's passing along a Russian video for their TV news where the anchor was interviewing Shoigu, the Russian defense minister. And many of you will probably have seen the clip, the 3 seconds, where the interviewer is asking, Shoigu, will we win in Ukraine? And the 3-second clip is just Shoigu shrugging, which, makes for a good meme. I asked some folks, hey guys, do you have the longer interview for context? And it's possible that Shoigu was shrugging, but then he gave a great defense or argument. It's also possible he only shrugged. It turns out that he shrugged and he essentially said, well, we don't have any choice. We must win in Ukraine. But a lot of people are pointing to his initial reaction in body language just being a shrug as not being a great sign. So I wanted to point that out, both because I think it's a bad sign about his personal evaluation of things, but also because that clip went out without context, and I think it's helpful to see it in the whole set of the interview. Okay, the next couple of points are just a few updates on the Starlink controversy. And as I discussed with some of you guys on Sunday, we're not going to dig way into the politics because it's kind of beyond the scope of our degree of interest. But a few points I did want to raise. The second item in the nest, there was a novel argument I hadn't seen a few days ago when we talked about it, where Musk was suggesting that the reason that he didn't turn Starlink service on in Crimea when the Ukrainians requested it to facilitate their attack on Sevastopol, assuming that's how it all went, right? There's some debate about whether the system was on or off or geofenced or what. And his novel claim is he's saying he also felt at the time that he couldn't turn it on because he worried that by enabling it might be to provide services to Russians who had Starlink terminals or dishes and terminals, and that might lead to SpaceX thereby violating U.S. sanctions by providing services in Russia. This seems like at this point he is just looking for additional excuses, is my interpretation of it. And this argument didn't appear to be raised initially, but I thought I would put it out there for you guys to consider. The third item is a tweet from Anne Applebaum, who wrote up an article in The Atlantic on her analysis of what she thinks Russia managed to accomplish, because of the reported conversations between Musk and the Russian ambassador, and Musk's concerns about getting involved in the war. Her article is titled "What Russia Got by Scaring Elon Musk." And so if you may not have seen that article, I think it's an interesting summary. Finally, the fourth item back is a tweet from NetBlocks, who does some very interesting work tracking internet connectivity. And, sometimes it can indicate power outages or cuts to comm systems. Just before the attack on Sevastopol the other day, they noted that Starlink service suddenly dropped out for an hour or two. And a lot of people are saying, in connection with this ongoing debate about Starlink service in the Crimea region, it's pretty coincidental that it would drop out right when the Ukrainians sound like they're conducting an attack. I don't know if they're connected. I haven't seen anybody presenting evidence that, would be convincing to show that this outage is, intentional as opposed to just coincidental. But again, it's, contributing to some of the debate, whether Starlink may have tried to interfere once again. Okay, I'll move on to some updates about developments in the Black Sea. I'm sure that's what a lot of you have come to chat about, because it was the most significant thing in the last couple of days. So I'm going to start by walking through, some of the OSINT work that was done in connection with the initial report of the strike. Just to show you how people figured things out and how we can be confident of the reports that we're hearing. Okay. So it should pop up in just a moment. The first tweet that I included is from an organization called Black Sky, and Black Sky does geospatial intelligence. They're new to me, but I know some friends of ours follow them. And their tweet is satellite imagery following the attack that shows the difference, the before and after of the battle damage, just to confirm that the attack did strike the dry docks in Sevastopol. there are a couple of interesting imagery accounts, Black Sky, Box Micah, and a few others, who sound like they're working in the intelligence field with imagery, and they're out there, trying to make a name for their analysis. And I think a bunch of them are doing great work. So I'd encourage you to check these accounts out, maybe give them a follow, because they seem like they're developing, completely new techniques. So that overhead satellite confirmation of the strike is tweet number 1. Tweets 2 and 3 are geolocations of it. So the second item is the thread from OSINT Technical. Technical does a great job at aggregating news as it's coming in. And so in there, if you scroll through his thread, you'll see his geolocation that was based on footage filmed from the ground that showed the orientation of a set of cranes that could be matched up as against the cranes in the dry dock. If you scroll down, I'm actually kind of proud that I had replied to an earlier tweet of his. I think I may have been one of the first people to identify the dry dock as the strike location. So I suggested he could confirm it based on the cranes, and whether he had it in progress and we had the same thought, I'm not sure. But anyway, that's the first confirmation of it. You'll see in OSINT's Technical's thread, he also included some footage from our friend MT Anderson, who does regular satellite imaging of the ports to confirm the location of Russian ships. The third item back is from Radio and Nukes, which is an alternative geolocation. It's always helpful to have more than one, just to double check, of footage that instead of being, looking from the west to the east, this is looking from the south to the north. So that's more good work. And then another friend of ours, Neon Handrail of GeoConfirm, did a third location based on another set of footage. The fourth item back in the nest is the tweet from MT Anderson. Just about every day or every 2 days, he does get this imagery of the various ports, not just Sevastopol, but often Novorossiysk and Tartus and some others, which is dedication. Believe me, that takes a lot of work. And just to highlight that by having this and knowing what's usual, we knew that within just a few hours before the strike, what ships were in the dry docks. So the Twitter intelligence community could almost immediately say, wow, there was a kilo that was likely still in dry dock at the time of the strike. So it's that kind of, dedicated work that it's, again, where, preparation meets opportunity, and it is a valuable contribution to the overall analysis. A couple more quick bits of info in connection with the strike. Let's see. They are just heading up to the nest now. So the first of which is a discussion about what munitions may have been used in the strike. Interestingly, head of the Ukrainian Air Force, Mykola Oleshchuk, came out and he congratulated his pilots for their excellent combat work in connection with the strike, which has led a lot of people to speculate that it was likely either Storm Shadow or Scalp missiles that were used. Whenever a strike like this occurs, there's lots of sort of misinfo that goes around, like Rybar, the Russian channel, was saying it was ATACMS. Usually we hear that from pro-Ukraine accounts, but it wasn't in this case. Sky News in the UK came out and said they also thought it was Storm Shadow. And then some accounts on Telegram came out and said that there may have been 8 to 10 total missiles. And the suggestion is that it may have been a combined attack using S-200 missiles in land attack mode, in addition to Storm Shadow missiles, the idea being to overwhelm air defenses before the more stealthy Storm Shadows struck. If you, so that second tweet in the nest is from Misfit, just passing along those claims from Telegram. I'll go to the hands in just a moment, but the third item back, the tweet from Elint News, it includes, there's a set of videos here ELINT is highlighting, so you have to click through his quote tweet, but if you were to look at the third video from Rob Lee that
I think we've lost Mr. Bond again. I will just my point was that I think there's a whole bunch of questions we don't actually know yet about this particular strike, and munitions obviously is one of them, but damage to the actual dry dock is something that I think would be really interesting to understand. I was talking to some people earlier today about depending on the damage to the ships, obviously you need to remove them one way or another. Is there a possibility that they can float those out? Well, we don't even know if they can actually open the doors to the dry dock. So that may or may not be an actual possibility. And it strikes me that work like MT Anderson to continue looking at the satellite images and kind of watching the evolution of what happens in the next couple of days will be really important and instructive in making more of an assessment of what the damage actually is there. And I think you're back, Mr. Bond.
I am. So what I was highlighting was, again, I put one or two more items up in the nest. So it's now the fifth tweet back. But the tweet from ELINT News, you have to click through the quote tweet. The third video down, tweeted out by Rob Lee, you see the flashes of the strikes. And ELINT News here is saying he thinks that 4 missiles may have struck. I know there was other footage that only showed 2. From the video that he's highlighting, I think that some of the explosions he's noting may have been secondary explosions from the target that was struck. I would guess that it was either 2 or 3 strikes with 1 or 2 secondary explosions, but you can look at the video itself and judge on your own. It's likely we'll, not know for quite a long time until the Ukrainians tell us precisely what the mix was, whether it was just many Storm Shadows or whether they did use S-200s, and how many Storm Shadows they may have used. But I think the suspicion is that they used 1 per dock in the dry dock to strike the ships. So it may therefore have been 2 with some secondary explosions. The next set of material is just going up now, but it's essentially just our confirmation of the damage. So the first that will pop up. So, I started the discussion about the strike on Sevastopol by showing the satellite imagery from Black Sky. If you were to take a look in the nest now, though, we're starting to get some ground footage of the damage. So that first tweet that should pop up in just a moment is from Kherson Cat, and it's damage to the landing ship Minsk. That's pretty significant. It looks like it's almost its entire superstructure has been burned away. And several analyses that I've seen suggest that it is beyond economic repair. So it's a loss of a ship. The second item in the nest, tweet from Rob Lee, is some ground footage of the Kilo sub. It was identified, I believe, as the Rostov-on-Don, and if I'm not mistaken, it was confirmed to be an improved Kilo because there are, different models. So it's good to have the ground-based loss confirmation. If you wanted to learn a little bit more about the Kilo, because it's an extremely valuable asset, costing hundreds of millions of dollars at minimum, the third item back in the nest is an update from H.I. Sutton with general background on that class of submarine. The let's see here. The fourth item down is an update, again, from our friend MT Anderson, who notes that, it was a significant attack and that the Russians were still engaging in fire suppression more than 2 days later. So things were still burning. I presume these ships have lots of chemicals on them that are particularly hazardous. And I know some friends of ours had suggested that the batteries in the submarine may burn for a long, long time. So in a lot of the video footage, you'll see that there's a big water cannon that's still spraying it several days later. The fifth item, back in the nest, I thought this was interesting, just as another way to keep track of the mounting losses of ships from the Black Sea Fleet. It's the tweet from Herman Caron, and it's not completely up to date. You'll see if you click through that I actually responded to him to note one or two other losses one other loss and then some other attempted attacks that he hadn't noted. So I suspect that he'll be putting out an updated version of this if he hasn't already. But I kind of like this idea of tracking it using the inventory of the fleet to keep an eye on it, because losses are absolutely starting to mount. Okay, a couple more things in connection with the Sevastopol attack, sort of in terms of the strategic impact, and then we'll move on to today's reports of additional USV strikes. Okay, so these first items relate to the condition of the dry docks and why they are important. So I was curious after these strikes happened to see how much damage was done to the docks themselves, because I was thinking that they're rare and their destruction would be a significant blow to the operations of the fleet. So I encourage people just ask questions, as I did here. I think it will just populate in the moment. But essentially what I said was, based on the satellite imagery, it didn't look like the gates themselves took much damage. The bays did not flood. What should we, other than clearing out the wreckage, what should we be looking for to evaluate the degree of damage? And I'd encourage you to read the replies, because lots of thoughtful folks, including friends of ours like Sal, replied and explained details, like dry docks are extremely difficult to damage. They do have some systems, the gates, the pumps, and the cranes that can take damage, but that if the ships are considered a write-off, it's likely that they can be, have minimal adjustment made to them and they can be floated out for removal. The docks themselves may require some repair, but those systems are generally not hard to locate. This is my guess, and I'm not an expert, but I would guess that finding cranes, if they were damaged, might be one of the more pressing problems. So it sounds like the docks will likely be out of commission for a time, but it's not as if they have been destroyed. Exit, go ahead.
It just came to me as you were talking about that their relationship with China right now might be helpful in that China happens to have a whole bunch of crane systems that are actually quite popular across the world and kind of a security issue, but they might be willing to supply them to Russia for these types of replacement things. I don't know what the shipping time would be on to get them across country and such, but that's an option for those. The other thing that we haven't seen is there's the one video of the Minsk from one side, but we haven't seen video of the submarine or the other side of the ship. And because those two fires were quite close on the insides there, it's likely there's more damage to the other side of the ship. And so watching out for another video that actually details that damage or some other imaging of some sort would be really helpful to understanding exactly what's going on there. And obviously there's a section of dock in between there as well that might be interesting to see, because it would likely have the most heat damage of all of the surrounding area.
Most of the sort of expert accounts that I've looked at on here seem to be of the opinion that the submarine will similarly be beyond economic repair. But I suppose that still remains to be discovered. In some ways, it's kind of a watch and await scenario in that from satellite imagery, we'll see how quickly and carefully they handle the wreckage and or damaged ships. It'll also be interesting to see if they fairly quickly, flood the bays, because if the pumps aren't working, if they flood them and then can drain them, then that will indicate a lot of the major systems are still working. So those are things that will become clear in time. If we don't get reports leaked from those who work at the docks. So we'll keep our eyes on that particular dry dock. The second and third items speak to how it may be significant. So the second item, my mind turned shortly after the strike to, well, what other facilities do they have nearby? How limited are these things? So I put it up, in a joking way, just saying if I were some of these other dry docks, I would be nervous. But these are screenshots of Google Earth just in Sevastopol. You'll see that there is one other fixed dry dock bay. And then there are several floating dry docks. I think it's 6 or 7 of them. If you're interested, at the bottom of each image, the Latin long is included from Google Earth, so you can go and look at them yourselves. I understand some of these are used for civilian purposes. And based on the idea that dry docks are very hard to destroy and perhaps not super complicated to repair, whether any of these will be targeted, remains unclear. But even if they're put out of commission briefly, it seems like supply of them is very limited. So if you were to look at the third item in the nest, Granger, who his account does great coverage of some naval matters, particularly in the Philippines and the Pacific more broadly, noted that because the Sevastopol ports were available to the Russians when they more recently built the Novorossiysk naval base, apparently they changed the plan in order, and they opted not to include big dry dock facilities there. So Granger's thread, he goes into a little bit more about how these were some of the most critical dry docks because they did the sort of deepest degree of repair. So again, it's unclear how significant the damage to them is, but any time out of service will limit the fleet's ability to sort of keep up with deep maintenance. Exit, go ahead.
This is a question, not a statement. Would the dry docks not be somewhat flooded already if the pumps weren't working because of the firefighting?
That is probably a question best left to a naval expert, so that's not me. I don't know whether they have like a basic drain system for small amounts of water. It strikes me that might be prudent. But I'll admit I don't know what their capacity is sort of for passive draining. But it's a good point. I also don't know how much total water the firefighting would have thrown into the bay, but excellent question. So if anybody happens to know, feel free to come up and explain to us how that works. Okay, last 2 points in this block. The fourth item in the nest, I just think it's interesting because if you look around long enough, with many sorts of, strategic failures, intelligence failures, you'll often find somebody who was out there screaming about it in advance. So this is the Russian equivalent. I thought it was interesting. There was one, apparently, Telegram blogger who had pointed out that these dry docks were within range of the Storm Shadow missiles, and that they probably shouldn't be putting their high-value targets in them there. And so I thought, anyway, that was an interesting development. Obviously, you'll always find somebody who claims this, and I suspect there just weren't any alternative for the Black Sea Fleet other than continuing to use them. But this guy can now sit there and say, I told you so. Finally, the fifth item in the nest, tweet from Elint News, is just a reminder about, putting this in perspective, that just in the last couple of days, the Ukrainians destroyed an S-400 launcher at Tarkanat. They removed these radar and oil sensors They removed these radar and sensor systems from the oil and gas platforms, and now they can make use of them. That they may be attacking ships from the Black Sea Fleet They certainly struck the dry docks, and that they just hit another S-400 at Yevpatoria. So it seems like the pace of shaping operations against Crimea is really picking up. Okay, speaking of which, we'll move on to some quick updates on reported USV attacks just in the last day. I'll just put these up. Okay. So there's been a long series of USV attacks. We've spoken about several of them. Nukes, Exit, and I did an analysis of a compilation video showing the POV video from a bunch of the USV strikes the Ukrainians have carried out over the last 6 months or so. So there's a long history here. I'm not sure if anybody has written up the complete history, but we'll find that down the road. Sorry, I'm just waiting for the last item in the nest to populate. So the first item should be the tweet from Kupshur. And that's the video that was released today by the Ukrainians, claiming that it's from a USV attack on the Vasily Baikov, which is a patrol vessel that's often in an escort duty for the Russians. I believe it was escorting the SIG, if I'm not mistaken, when it was struck by a USV. And if you wanted, I'm getting a thumbs down, so maybe it was the Kotov. Or were they escorting the landing ship, the Gornyak? Anyway, we'll get to that in a minute. If you have a look at the second item in the nest, that's a bit of an overview about where these ships were believed to be. And in this case, this is H.I. Sutton who's tweeting about it, and he believes that once again they were escorting. It was either the sister ship of the SIG, or it was one of the sister ships of the Ro-Ro cargo vessels that often carry military vehicles. So have a look at Sutton's breakdown in the second tweet in the nest. Jacoby, go ahead.
My question goes back to the attacks that were seen in Sevastopol, as well as what you're highlighting right now. But you'd mentioned, and a couple people had spoken to, an increase, what appears to be an increase in shaping operations or attacks on the part of Ukraine, and whether or not if that is the case, that is indicative of Russia in that particular area being on its back heel, or maybe not having the munitions or defenses that they have had, or that they're running low on resources, or that it's really not indicative of anything other than just an escalation in attacks on the part of Ukraine, or if it's too early to really tell what it's indicative of.
Well, speaking to, you referred to limited munitions. I haven't heard that. In just a moment, so I think it's in the next block of reference material I have. A week ago today, our guest was Dr. Mike Peterson, who covered the Russian naval forces, and we had lots of discussion about developments in the Black Sea as at that time. And just today, he put out a thread essentially saying it seems like the Russian commander of the Black Sea Fleet has lost the initiative, and here are some ways that they have failed at that. And he seems to suggest that it's no one cause, but perhaps a lack of imagination. or as in the battle between innovation that the Ukrainians are pursuing and the imagination of the Russians to anticipate what the next steps may be or how they need to defend, they're failing at that. So I'll put that thread up in a moment, and we can dive into it a little more deeply. Just continuing on the USV question. So again, there's this footage of the attack on the Baikov that the Ukrainians have released. Second item is H.I. Sutton breaking down where it took place and what ships may have been involved. I'll note that the Russian MOD came out and said that the attack involved 5 USVs, and their claim is that they destroyed all 5. In the last couple of hours, when I was prepping for the space, since then, I haven't seen any evidence, whether in past cases that sometimes we'll see AIS tracks for tugboats or repair ships. Sometimes people have claimed to have intercepted communications, helicopter to ship, where helicopters are out flying to evaluate damage to ships. I haven't heard about any of that happening in this case. So there's no evidence yet of damage resulting from the attacks, and the Russians claim there is none. So again, we'll just have to keep our eyes out on that front. Although Exit's put her hand up, so there may be an update.
I don't have an update on that, actually. Sorry, and just the correction earlier, the SIG was at anchor outside the Kerch Bridge, and the Baikov was escorting the Sparta 1, I think, one of the Sparta ships. Sparta 4, sorry. When it was first attacked, it was the Baikov and the Kotov that were doing that. So I guess I would, to Jacoby's question and to all of this, there's been a ton of reports from Russian MOD lately about USV attacks, potential USV attacks. We aren't getting a whole bunch of corresponding information back from anybody else to verify any of it. And so it's hard to really be sure that there is an increase or is not an increase, because there just isn't other information out there, and you're not really sure what to do with Russian MOD information because it is sometimes not correct. And I think it just leaves everybody asking a whole bunch more questions that we just don't have the answers to, and we don't seem to be finding more open source information about it. And Ukraine doesn't seem to be forthcoming with a lot of information at the moment, probably for some really good reasons. But it leaves all of us sitting here going, okay, what more information can we look for? And there just isn't a lot right now. I think that goes back to the conversation with Mike as well, that there is a lot happening out in the Black Sea, and it's not entirely a dead space for people looking for it, but there's not a lot of sensors to be aware of and to use when you're trying to figure out what the story is.
Right. And just so you guys know, my approach in reporting on it is, if the Russians say that there was a USV attack, and that's all we have, I usually don't even mention it. If it has some unique characteristic, like when the Russians claimed that there was an attempted attack on the Kerch Bridge, where one of the attacking USVs may have reversed course and tried to blend in with ships at anchorage, that was sort of a unique claim of a tactic. So I discussed that, but otherwise I don't talk about them. I'm highlighting this one because the Ukrainians actually released footage. So it seems like something happened. Again, we just don't know the outcome. I will also point out that I do think the Russians are making claims of events that don't occur, sort of to say, hey, look how well we defend. However, in past compilations that the Ukrainians have released, sometimes the released footage has been completely new, and it actually matched up with incidents where the Russians claimed an attack, but the Ukrainians explicitly denied that same attack. And it turned out the attack did occur. So the Ukrainians, for operational information warfare reasons, denied it, but then later came out and said, well, here's the footage that proves it. So again, we don't know what we don't know, but sometimes Ukraine is saying either silent or saying these things didn't happen when in fact they do. So continuing on updates on attacks on using USVs, third item back in the nest is actually the day before the Sevastopol attack, or the morning before the Sevastopol attack. The Ukrainians also claimed a USV strike that destroyed one of these little, like a patrol boat or a landing boat. I don't even know if it's a Navy ship, or excuse me, a Navy boat as opposed to an Army vessel. I'm not sure who runs those things, but the model type is, what is it, a KS 701. So it's quite a small boat. You can see it in the image. And the tweet is from Exit. She is passing along, because it was, I think, a Moscow Times article in Russian. She's saying the Ukrainians say they destroyed 3 Russian ships. The 2 of those ships are the 2 struck in dry dock. The third is this little KS 701. So again, I haven't seen FPV footage released by the Ukrainians of this strike, but they're claiming they destroyed the ship, so we might see that down the road. Go ahead, Exit.
Because I'm promoting everybody apparently today. The Ukrainian Navy has a cool little Twitter account. They don't have very many followers. They're really cool. They didn't get any traction when they released all of that early in the morning. It wasn't until the main defense account talked about it in the afternoon that everybody kind of paid attention to the fact that they had done this. So go follow them, because they do good work. Apparently they keep making stuff blow up, which is kind of cool.
Sounds good. 2 last points on this block, then we'll get into the oil rigs. The 4th item back in the nest, again, flowing from our conversation with Mike Peterson last week. He actually had a question to us, which is, had anybody seen any footage that seemed to suggest that these USVs were being used as recon platforms? Because he said, if they have the capacity, that would only make sense, and not solely for attack. Excuse me. Or I think he also suggested use as repeaters, for instance. And one of our listeners, I have Stolas, saw this video that came out just earlier today, and it seemed to show one instance where the drone just filmed. Now, from previous releases, sometimes the drones appear to attack sort of in waves, or on separate timings. So it's possible this drone filmed and then subsequently attacked, but I'm glad that one of our listeners was paying attention to the question and took a shot at answering Peterson directly. So that was pretty cool. The 5th item is a story written in Euromaidan Press from David Kirichenko. And there are several articles that have come out on UAVs in the last few days, and their general rate of progress. This is one focused on the Ukrainian tech developments with unmanned surface vessels, USVs. So I think there are some interesting details in that article if you want to check it out. Okay, moving on to the drilling rigs. There are 4 items here. A lot of them are references to some outside material, outside analysis. The first of these items that is popping up is just footage that the Ukrainians released. It's like a 13 or 14 minute video that shows the operations to land on the rigs. It also identified a bunch of equipment on there, and it showed the types of units that were involved in seizing them. So yeah, that first item will populate in just a moment. Go ahead, Exit.
Just before you get into that, I got a message from a listener that gives us a little bit more information about the dry docks and my question that I had. And so those dry docks do drain at the bottom. So with fire trucks and tugs throwing water, several thousand gallons of water would pool at the bottom. The lack of water does indicate that the pumps may be, don't laugh at me, nukes, I'm Canadian, okay? So the lack of water at the bottom does indicate that the pumps are possibly operating. It could also be that the pumps aren't operating and they've brought in outside pumps, but that would probably drain much slower than the regular pumps. And then also, it looks like the gates are, and I'm going to say this word incorrectly, caissons, maybe, which are single pieces that are floated out of position. And the fact that they're not leaking yet is a good indicator that the dock is intact. And I think that was it. That was the update. So thank you to the listener who sent that in. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we have lots of expertise in the listeners to these spaces, so we often learn lots of things ourselves. So again, the first item is just the footage of the capture of the rigs, lots of interesting details in it. So a couple of attempts to break down the significance of it, I'll highlight to you to take away for later. The second item in the nest was an interview by our friend Yorick Issac, who is the ship spotter in the Bosporus, who does terrific work. We refer to him often. And he doesn't do a lot of media, but he did do an interview with TVP World about the implications of the capture of these drilling rigs. And the interview is now on YouTube, which is pretty nice. Maybe we'll convince York to come and chat with us someday. The third item in the nest is a tweet from Mark Krutov, who is an editor at Radio Free Europe. And this is a pretty detailed and long thread, so I would encourage you to dig into it a little bit. But it breaks down the types of equipment that were captured, including some fairly significant electronic warfare pieces that are used for jamming, and a variety of radar sensors as well. Yeah, lots of detail in there for people who are into radio and EW, including the NAVA radars that appear to have been captured. And sorry, I'm just scrolling through it because there was one more really interesting one here. Yeah, about a week ago, we did discuss some claims. There was I think it was a week ago today, there was a Euromaidan article claiming that the Ukrainians may have been using these rigs for operation, but we just didn't have confirmation at that time. Yeah, so if you scroll way down the thread, you'll see there's one entry in it where it says bonus tweet, and it discusses, it's a much longer write-up about the types of radars that are installed on the rig and their capacities. So anyway, once again, dig into that if you'd like some details. The fourth item up in the nest is sort of a collaborative effort here. So the tweet is by Sal Mercogliano, who is a friend of ours, who does great work covering maritime matters, and he does a YouTube show called "What's Going On with Shipping" that I've recommended before. Go and check that out on YouTube. In this case, he's doing a reaction to a video produced by Covert Shores. So if you were to click through, the YouTube link is the video Covert Shores did about why it matters that Ukraine has retaken these platforms. And then Sal adds his own commentary on top of that. So do check out, I would suggest both the video and the thread to you. Okay, let me see. Where was I? Okay. That was really just reference because there's so much great content on the drilling rigs already. I didn't want to spend too long digging into it. The next little bit is just talking about the implications, because I'm trying to move toward the economic aspects here. And this is to talk about the sort of impact on commercial shipping and what it may mean if the Ukrainians are able to put pressure on the Russians in Crimea, if these similar strikes to what we're seeing on the air defense systems were to persist as against some of the shore-based anti-ship missile systems, eliminating that threat could really free up or remove the risk to commercial shipping, which might allow a Ukrainian alternative to the Black Sea Grain Initiative to take root, because the shippers will feel they can accept the risk, the reduced level of risk. So leading off, the first item in the nest, tweet from Jimmy Rushton. This was from just 3 days ago. Interestingly, the British government claims that the Russians fired 2 missiles at a civilian cargo ship on August the 24th. But apparently, the Ukrainian air defenses intercepted both of these. I don't think the Ukrainians made any announcement. It's interesting that the British came out and said it a couple of weeks later. But this speaks to, there had been speculation about why are the Russians not trying to interdict Ukrainian shipping more? Well, the answer is they tried. And so there was that one incident where the Russians boarded a ship. But now apparently it's clear they took a shot at this one cargo ship. And we also saw that sort of in that same time period, several other civilian ships departed Odessa. There were reports of, I think, at least 4. And I wonder whether their knowledge of the risk based on this couple of shots the Russians took may have affected their decision to depart at that time. I'm going to go to Exit as co-host, and then we'll go to Hoffy Buns. Go ahead, Exit.
I guess I would just say that the fact that UK intelligence released this and that Ukraine hasn't commented on it at all probably should point us towards the fact that no matter what we do hear and see, there's always more going on that we aren't aware of. And even as much time and effort as I put into watching all of the stuff that goes on in Odessa, that was never anything that we were really aware of. And I know there's other things that happened that we haven't been made aware of and aren't public either. So it just is probably a really great reminder that there's lots going on that we don't see in the public or anywhere else, Telegram, all of these other places. Even the people that we talk to on a regular basis, we just aren't always seeing the full picture, and it's probably a good reminder for us.
Yeah, some humility about the fog of war is always a good idea. Hoffy Buns, go ahead.
Okay, so my whole thinking about, taking back those 2 oil rigs in the Black Sea right now, it really opens up the possibility for Ukraine to be able to actually move all the grain ships through, because right now Russia is scared. They lost a submarine, 2 days ago. They lost another landing ship. They lost at least one missile carrier, the Kilo class submarine, to be able to actually shoot missiles at Odessa. Now, with the capture of the 2, oil rigs over there, Ukraine just expanded the area that they control. So I think there's going to be a lot more grain coming through Ukraine right now than through Russia. Russia is right now, they don't know what is happening. They also had, they just destroyed the S-400 system in Crimea too. So they're going to be actually affected by more drone attacks now. Crimea, I'm not talking about Moscow or any of those places, but every single time you see those attacks happening, and they're smart attacks. When they attacked Crimea a couple days ago, they sent S-200 rockets to cover the storm shadows, and 2 out of 3 storm shadows actually hit the pen where they had one of the Kilo class submarines and the other ship, a Polish made ship, that transports troops. I mean, this is the second troops transporter that they lost within 1 month.
Right. So I agree with you, and I think we're definitely on the same page. We just spent a fair while talking about the strike on Sevastopol and about the apparent shaping operations in terms of Crimea and air defense. How much it affects the ability to ship grain remains an open question. I will in a minute go to exit. I'll just highlight some additional considerations. So while these strikes are taking place on Russian air defenses, that appears to be the Ukrainians trying to enable, or enhance the success of subsequent strikes. However, there are other types of systems that remain threats. So if you were to look at the second and third items in the nest, they're similar but slightly different. Our friend Colby said really what the Russians should be worrying about is strikes on their Bastion coastal batteries, right? Their anti-ship missile systems that they've been using to hit Odessa with. And in particular, Colby's suggesting that if the Ukrainians get ATACMS, that the attacks against these anti-ship systems would have a very high likelihood of success, and that taking that additional threat off the board would reduce the risk to Ukrainian shipping. But I suspect there are others that will persist. Similarly, the third item in the nest is a tweet from Benjamin Patet, and he's saying that essentially, broadly, if the Russian missile launchers are pushed back, whether that be land-based, like Colby speaking to the Bastion, but in theory, if most of the missile carriers also departed Sevastopol, right, and if reducing Russian air defenses also put at risk more of the airfields in Crimea, then sort of ship-based, air-based, land-based missile systems would all be pushed back, which would contribute to reduction in risk to the shipping corridors. I'm going to go to exit, then we'll go back to Hoffy Buns.
Yeah, I just would say that I don't think that we have seen enough of a change in Russia's actions in the Black Sea to convince the majority of ship owners that that's a risk that they want to take. I think that it's possible we might start seeing some smaller ships, older ships, just like we saw at the beginning of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, that might start looking into that. But they still have an insurance challenge because insurance is exponentially higher for Ukraine than it is for the Russian Black Sea ports. There's a lot of challenges, and I am not yet, until I actually see a ship in an Odessa area port, I will not be convinced that we have actually met all of the criteria that are going to convince ship owners to take that challenge, because it's not small, and your risk, it's decreased a little bit, but it's not like Russia is out of ships or planes, for that matter, that could strike a ship in the Black Sea. So as much as we all want to see that happen tomorrow, and I'm leading the charge on that cheer, I'm not convinced yet that that is actually the case. And I think that the more we see Russia or Ukraine attacking Russia in Crimea, especially, the higher or the lower the risk goes for Ukrainian bound ships.
Yeah, I hear you, and I know you're a close observer of that whole dynamic. Go ahead, Hoffy Buns.
Okay, here's the one thing. I think we're giving Russia way too much credit about what they are actually able to do. I don't know if you guys have been paying attention, but Russia has been pulling you're talking about like S-300s, S-400 systems from the east side. You're talking about Vladivostok and putting those up in Moscow. I mean, this is like a last grab to like trying to protect Moscow and St. Petersburg. So, I mean, from what I'm seeing in Telegram, on Twitter, and all the other news sites, not MSM. You cannot trust MSM. They're just like looking for clicks. But whatever I see in Telegram, Twitter, and all of the other places, Russia is hurting really bad right now. I mean, all the rockets that didn't explode going over Ukraine, those are all chips out of the like freaking washing machines that they stole out of Ukraine. I mean, they're really pulling on like, they're trying to make this work, but it's not working, especially when they are putting on, book systems, which should be mobile, right? Mobile book systems, that's what they're designed for. And they're putting on pedestals in freaking Moscow. I mean, this is like...
Yeah, I hear your criticism. You say, you don't know if we've been paying attention. What I would suggest is if there's one thing that we in these spaces really focus on is the fact that we are paying attention. So I wouldn't worry about that.
No, I'm not saying that. You know exactly what I'm saying. It's like, I'm just saying It's like, we got to feel a little bit better about that,
So I'm going to argue that it's not, it doesn't really matter how we feel. What matters with regard to export of grain is how the shippers feel. And they have a whole lot of incentive to pay close attention to the degree of risk. So, we'll see how it plays out in terms of their willingness to actually, take on the risk. And there are a bunch of dynamics, including if missile systems continue to be struck and are theoretically pushed back, even though aircraft may remain a threat, that could be offset by other things like a Ukrainian insurance program, and or some of these reports, about Ukrainian air defenses having success at defending against the Russian missiles sent against cargo ships. So we'll keep a close eye on it, and I appreciate your opinion, but I still think it might be a little early for the shippers to be committing, the value of their ships. Okay. The next set of material it gets into the economics. I hope to go through this pretty quickly. So if you guys have any comments, we'll just keep them brief, hopefully. The first item in the nest, though, speaks to the question that Jacoby asked earlier about why might the Russians be essentially failing on several fronts here. And now this is not to say that they're failing, comprehensively, but they're definitely failing on a lot of fronts. And whether that adds up to a strategic failure or not, there seem to be a couple of arguments on it. Interestingly, when Mike Peterson was in our space, he seemed to suggest that the Russian Navy had been carrying out its basic functions reasonably well. But then, since then, he decided to come out with this thread, the first in the nest, talking about how he thinks that they have essentially lost the strategic initiative and they've failed to take steps necessary to their defense and adapt to Ukrainian tactics. So if you want his expert opinion on things, which seems to have evolved a little bit with some of these recent Russian failures, do read his thread. Okay, in terms of econ, the second item in the nest is a summary. Is it Oleg Kuprikov? I think it's Oleg, who is the Ukrainian Minister of Infrastructure, came out in this Kiev Independent article and discussed how 105 different facilities of port infrastructure have been damaged or destroyed by the Russian strikes in the last 2 months. So you get a sense, and these are facilities in several of the deep water ports, also the Danube ports of Reni and Izmail. So it's interesting to see an overview of the degree of the damage. Supporting that, just to bring in an OSINT angle to it, the third item in the nest is some battle damage assessment showing damage to fuel tanks at the Ukrainian port at Kilia just south of Odessa. And I just want to highlight this because there are folks out there who, besides these sort of big flashy items like the attack on Sevastopol, are back there in the trenches pulling down satellite imagery on attacks on some of these infrastructure points, which is work that I appreciate. So people are slowly keeping track of this. If some of it seems like it's being done privately, I'm not seeing a lot of OSINT people who are doing it comprehensively, like here are all the damage from the various strikes across time with satellite imagery. That might be a cool project for somebody to undertake just to catalog it. Yeah, go ahead, Exit.
It's interesting because Nukes and I were actually chatting earlier this evening about the idea of all these other things that we'd love to do sat imaging on and such. And I think for just general people like me, for instance, as much as I would love to take on a project like that, it's cost prohibitive. So unless you have a giant group of people who are going to donate a whole bunch of money to it, or you have some kind of strategic plan with some of the sat carriers, those types of things, it just doesn't make economic sense for most of us unless we win the lottery. So if somebody can sell me a winning lotto ticket, I would love to take on things like that. And I'm sure that Nukes and others would love to do similar work. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be a thing that is just doable at the moment.
And so just to translate for Exit, when she says somebody sell me a winning lottery ticket, what she's essentially saying is, hey, any of these SAT companies that listen to this, if you want to work out a deal where you give us access and then we, wear whatever satellite imagery company t-shirts while we hold our conversations here on Spaces, we can do that. I'm sure we'd happily do that. Okay. Quick.
Or like taco.
And now a message from our sponsor.
Yes, now a message from our sponsor. Go ahead, Hoffy. Did you have another joke to come in there, Hoffy Buns?
No.
Okay.
I see exactly. Everybody's like frustrated about about what is happening. We just need to stay, like happy. I mean, I know this sounds positive, but it's not going to happen. We just need to I can tell Michael. I can tell you one thing. I've been doing this since like freaking 2008 when Georgia got invaded, and I was scared the shit out of because my wife's family is from Georgia and they're attacking. I was happy. I was working for one of the biggest companies, and they had actually CIA connections. And they said the Russians will stop exactly right there. We actually knew exactly where they would stop. Right now, I don't have that comfort zone anymore. I don't know where the Russians are going to stop now.
Yeah. So, you had suggested a positive attitude, and that's definitely the approach that we're going to take. Go ahead, Nukes.
I just wanted to come back in on the satellite imagery a little bit. It's definitely expensive. I can vouch for that. I know I talk with some of the other sat image people that do these things, and some of them have got access through a company for their work. Some of them are paying for it directly. Some of them have got deep pockets. It just kind of varies. But one thing I've noticed, and I think that we could probably be a little better as a community, the satellite imagery companies probably don't want this, but when these big events happen like Sevastopol, the same image comes out 1,000 times from 1,000 different accounts, maybe not 1,000, but a lot. And there's not a lot of added value to that case. So I've kind of tried to stay away from these big events because I know the companies will either release the images directly or it'll come out from a big account or from some official source. So if there are some niche projects or some interesting things that aren't widely published that we could get sat image on and, do some deep analysis, I'd be game for that. So if anybody has any suggestions for anything to look at, my DM's open. Let me know, because it doesn't make a lot of sense for me to go pay for an image that's already on Twitter.
Yeah, that's a good point. And increased coordination is a good idea. And, we're working away on that a little bit slowly in the background. Jumping back into the economic updates, hopefully I can get these done in 3 or 4 minutes. Fourth item in the nest, there were 5 countries in the EU that were limiting or prohibiting the import of Ukrainian agricultural products. Bulgaria has now announced it will not be extending its restrictions, which is great news. You can see this is the tweet from Zelensky thanking them, appreciating that change. However, the 5th item in the nest, tweet from Bloomberg Economics, Poland has announced it does intend to extend its restrictions. And I didn't include links here, but there were several statements that Polish officials made, some of them talking about how they think it is appropriate for these restrictions on Ukrainian agriculture to persist until Ukraine is ultimately added as an EU member, and talking about how limitations of this type will need to be pursued as part of the negotiation process for accession or granting of EU membership, because the Polish official was saying that it would be extremely difficult for Polish farmers to compete with Ukrainian farmers given existing market dynamics. So it sounds like I don't know that sentiment sort of carries the Polish political position, but it definitely seems like there is a well of people who are suggesting this will continue to be an issue for some time and may come up in negotiations for EU membership. I'm going to go to Exodus co-host, and then we'll go to Rosalie.
So just an addition to that, the expiration date is September 15th, which is tomorrow. So hopefully we'll have a whole bunch more information and some clarity on that tomorrow.
And just so I can move material up, just before going to Rosalie, I'll point out the 6th and 7th items in the nest. 6th item is the good news that Romania has reported it has upgraded its Black Sea port infrastructure in order to facilitate more export of Ukrainian grain. So that's good news. And then the item behind that, which just disappeared, was a tweet mentioning that unfortunately Ukrainian grain exports are down 50% this year versus last year. And I'll put that back up in the nest so you guys can make reference to it. Go ahead, Rosalie.
Hey guys, I just wanted to kind of share that on the topic of just grain and trade in Europe. There's been a lot of disinformation that's very specific about the grain. So when you said that Bulgaria changed their policy, that's actually really, really important, because for everybody who doesn't know, Bulgaria essentially does not have a free press. Much of their press is owned by oligarchs. It's owned by networks that coordinate disinformation, and it's like copy and paste from the Russian state. So it's really remarkable that they've done that, and I think that's encouraging. But some of the narratives that I'm seeing about grain are they're getting creative, shall we say. So I just sort of wanted to share some of them in an effort to pre-bunk people. Some of them, it's really interesting. They're trying to like weave different issues together. So one of them I've seen is that Ukraine can't grow enough grain for people, and so people will starve. And the reason is because depleted uranium is poisoning their fields. This is obviously false. And if there is a reason, I don't know, I'd say the invasion's probably like on the top of the list. And some other claims that I've seen that are a little more outlandish is that Ukraine was poisoning the grain, which is like the most ridiculous thing ever. They rely on that trade as a country. It's like insanity. And there's been a couple other ones about how, like, just different things that it's exposed to because of the war and it won't be safe. So do keep an eye out for that. And as you watch the policies in especially the countries that border Ukraine, their grain policies, I would be looking closely.
Thanks for that. Sorry, confused my mic open and closed. Thanks for that. There have been a lot of crazy things said, so I'm glad people are paying attention to those narratives. Hoffy Buns, go ahead, but if you can be fairly brief, it would be great because I'm getting down to the part of the show where I feel crunched for time.
Oh yeah, no problem. So what I'm going to say, tell you right now, it's like the reason why Poland right now is like so scared about the grain coming from Ukraine is like because Poland has been supplying Europe with grain. Okay, so it's all a money issue, and we know. I mean, it needs to come west, right? It needs to. But Poland has a big problem with that. I mean, I'm German, Polish. I'm in America. I see all of this, and I work in the industry, so I know exactly what is happening. But what the Polish people are like worried about is about the fast-paced grain that goes through the country without their country being considered. This is the problem about Poland having a problem with that. And I mean, honestly, I don't have a problem with that. I don't live there. But I mean, I want the grain to be delivered to everybody. I do. I mean,
well, if you can have a word with them and try and convince them, then that would be a great outcome for everybody.
oh no, I know,
So-
but I mean, I'm from America. Who's going to listen to American in Poland and Ukraine? Nobody's going to listen to me.
Well, we'll see. We're listening to you for sure. All right. I am going to just move a little more quickly over the next couple of items, just so they get into the record. Hopefully, we'll take 20, 25 minutes to chat about some Ukrainian equipment items and some updates like the North Korea visit very briefly. So the last item on agricultural exports, I'm not going to break the tweets out individually to the nest, but if you look at the first item, there's an interesting article that discusses how important, or there's a thread that was written by John Paul Rathbone, accompanying a Financial Times article, about how crucial exports are, including through the Danube ports, because in a long war, it really is a question of resource accumulation, and that Ukraine's ability to support itself by continuing to export products is a critical component of that long-range perspective. The second tweet down is Exit's analysis of the very little bit that's known about the reported letter from UN Secretary General Guterres to the Russians about potentially resuming the Black Sea Grain Initiative. The upshot is the letter itself has not been found. We only really have rumors, or it's not published in public. We have reports from some people who claim to have seen it. Without specific details, it may not be worth getting particularly worked up about it at this time. And again, a call that if anybody sees it ultimately published, please do pass it along to Exit. Interestingly, the third item down there is a note that NATO is now holding some meetings because part of the blockade region that Russia has announced for purposes of Ukraine shipping actually covers territory in Bulgaria's exclusive economic zone. And so there's a bit of a discussion going on about how that can be responded to, what action should be taken to, demonstrate that Russia doesn't have the power to dictate use of that zone. And the last item in that tweet under the heading Black Sea Peace Dividend was an article that came out from the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA, on what's often being overlooked, which is the energy potential in the Black Sea. And we had a bit of a discussion about the Ukrainian use of the drilling rigs, but there's a ton of value, particularly natural gas, in the Black Sea, none of which is capable of being accessed right now. And to keep in mind that when the war comes to an end, there could be a huge dividend to Ukraine and their ability to control the mineral rights in the Black Sea and make use of that natural gas, which I think is a point that hasn't gotten much discussion lately. The second item in the nest is on the theme of the update on drones landing in Romania, because there have been new developments. So again, not breaking them out, but just reading through this one tweet. You'll see the links include a report that now debris from a third drone has been found just in the last few days. So as Russia has continued to strike the Danube ports, some drones apparently are continuing to cross the border and land in Romania. And those attacks, if not daily, are a near daily occurrence at this point. The second item notes that Romania has now summoned the Russian ambassador for a second time. The third tweet down there is some details about the development in Romania of shelters. We referred to them before, but now there's some pictures and you get a sense of them. Our friend Ion reported to us on Sunday that some regions have actually had it proposed that they be evacuated away from the immediate border regions, and apparently some people are considering that. And then the last tweet or the last link in that tweet, it says Romanian defenses moved forward, and here there's a little bit of evidence that highlights actions being taken by the Romanians. There's a link to an article that describes it all, including air defense being moved forward, sensor and observation posts being moved forward, increased Danube river patrols, and EOD teams who are on 24/7 standby. So we're not seeing a particularly aggressive response from NATO in response to the strikes by those drones, but there are some small steps being taken. My interface is just slowing down a little bit, so hopefully I'm still coming through. If we run for, say, another 20 minutes to 30 minutes just to get through some equipment updates, I probably need to reset. Exit, might you just take a moment to do some quick housekeeping?
I would love to, because I was reminded that I have not yet mentioned the fact that you can find recordings for pretty much all of our spaces on the YouTube channel, where some of our great friends record these spaces and broadcast them live. So you can, of course, tune in there, or you can, if you've missed the recording, you can come back and watch them live, or watch the recording there, sorry. If you go to the very, very, very front of the nest, it'll be the third one in from the right. There is a tweet from Cyber, and it'll give you the link to the YouTube channel. And you can go there at pretty much any time and be able to take a listen to all of the spaces. And I don't think Bond is back yet. So I'll just remind you all that if you do want to come up and chat with us, on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, you will see the request mic button. You can click that and we'll take a boo and bring you on up.
Thanks for covering for me for a moment. I will have to take a moment to get the next set of material up, just because when I reset the app, I also lose my place in the thread. I think what I'm going to do is similar to the last two items, rather than putting the individual tweets up, I'm probably instead just going to deal with them in their block form, and I'll speak to the entries, but it's up to you guys to click through to the individual tweets if they catch your interest. Okay, it should, yes, it's popped up now. So I try to organize these items by sort of type of weapons, whether it be drones, missiles, airplanes, ground vehicles. So this first block of material in the nest is about missile systems. So there is continuing back and forth in German politics, debating the delivery of the Taurus missiles, which are in some ways more sophisticated than the Storm Shadow and Scalp. There have been high hopes for it, and then the government appears to back away. Most recently, the first two items, the very first here is that 3 leading German members of parliament have written a letter endorsing the delivery of long-range missiles to Ukraine, which is a reference to Taurus. But my understanding is that these MPs are all from the opposition party. Similarly, I believe it's Annelies Baerbock, who is the German foreign minister, had a visit to Ukraine last week. She did some interviews talking about how Germany should provide an air defense umbrella to Ukraine. She also spoke about the need for long-range missiles to be provided because, in her words, there's this large defensive line, this large mine belt, and the Ukrainians need these missiles to strike items behind it in order to facilitate their offensive. So, again, Baerbock is in the government, but she's not in the ruling party. And so it seems like both opposition and some government members are pushing the matter, but still no progress. The third item down there is a tweet from our friend Colby, who highlights that Raytheon has now been awarded an $80 million contract in order to increase the production capacity of the AIM-9X air-to-air missile, which is an important thing because it's the only variant that can be integrated into NASAMS, of which Ukraine will be receiving a number of systems for their air defense. So hearing that AIM-9 capacity is increasing is good news. Also, the fourth link in that first item in the nest, under long-range cluster munitions, is a Reuters article where there's just some optimism expressed by U.S. officials that they may be given the long-range cluster bombs, which are the ATACMS variant, if I am remembering correctly, the M26. I haven't heard anybody, named official coming out publicly and saying there's progress there, but I do know that there are several people outside the government who have been prominently pushing for it. Colby, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so thanks. The 2 specific munitions which were referenced in that article are the ATACMS Block 1 and the Gimler's M30. Gimler's M30, it is very likely that none of those exist anymore. They were all slated to be converted into the alternative warhead Gimlers, which we see a lot of in Ukraine right now. But there are still a pretty large number of ATACMS Block 1 missiles still in existence. The only question is whether they are serviceable or not. But I think that the reporting that this is under consideration is very much credible, although the M30 is probably not, although perhaps that might be a mistake on the reporter's part, and the system that's actually being considered is the M26, which is an unguided cluster munition, the original munition that was designed for the M270. MLRS.
Yeah, thanks for those details. I just assumed one of those was the M26. So interesting hearing the details about the other items that are being speculated about. Hopefully we do hear some good news. And as Colby has noted, broadly and in discussion in our space about the availability of funds under the presidential drawdown program, and that there's still, I think it's slightly over $5 billion that's available, specifically authorized before the end of this fiscal year, which ends at the end of September. So who knows, maybe we will see some incentive for the U.S. to announce a couple of more significant drawdowns before the end of the month. Although if that were the case, we'd probably start to hear hints of them fairly soon. The next block in the nest, the second item, this relates to aircraft. And so the first tweet there is Gareth Jennings, who is, he's speculating a little bit, reading into some language in a press release where Denmark has said that they're receiving the first arrival of their F-35s, but then they say that they have increased some safety at the airbase in connection with the training of Ukrainian pilots. So he's inferring from that he thinks training may have now actually begun. I'd say it's hard to know, in that it could be increased security in anticipation of training beginning soon. But regardless, it does seem like if the training in Denmark has not yet begun, then it would be imminent. So that's good news. The second link there, again highlighted by Colby, is an article from the Associated Press where the Ukrainians who are being trained by the U.S. Air National Guard, they've come out and said they believe that the U.S. could have trained the first Ukrainian fighter pilots before the end of this year, although it may be a little bit longer before they're flying missions. And so when we spoke about this most recently, I think there was speculation that the Ukrainian Air Force had said something like they could be in Ukraine and as early as February. So the little bit of additional news here is that some training could even be complete this calendar year. Go ahead, Colby.
Yeah, on Denmark, today, the first 4 F-35s that they have on order actually arrived from the United States after their pilots concluded their training over there. And Danish media noted that as they arrived at the airbase, Skidstrup in Denmark, that base is also actively training those Ukrainian pilots. So that's definitely confirmed now, I would say.
That's great news. And for those who don't know, I mean, in the equipment section, I often take lots of tweets from our friends Colby and John, and just a handful of others. But the sampling you see me use, Colby and some of our other friends do great work tracking equipment contracts beyond just what goes to Ukraine. I only select the Ukraine relevant items. In general, I'm not reporting on the rearmament process of other European allies, a lot of which is significant, but it would just be too much to cover. And a lot of them are now buying new aircraft systems as well. So if you're interested in it more broadly, do check out Colby's profile. So again, working from the second item in the nest, the last 2 links relate to some announcements about the Swedish Gripens. So you'll see there was an announcement from the Swedish government that they would be looking into the feasibility of providing Gripens to Ukraine. And so if you have a look at the tweet translated by The Lookout, in his quote tweet is a link to the original article in Swedish that explains what the government is looking at specifically for investigation. And then the fourth link in that tweet was more specific speculation that the Gripens could go to Ukraine from Sweden as early as midsummer 2024. But that's, I think, a little bit more speculative. Again, It's been translated into English by the account Jamming. But if you want to read the original Swedish reporting, it's linked in the quote tweet. Moving on to the third item in the nest, this is a section on drones. A lot of this is just highlighting new novel drones. I'll admit that when I put these summaries together, this is partly for my own research purposes every week, where I pick, there's such a flood of information that I filter it initially by liking it usually. Then I do a second pass when I develop the agenda. And by having this series of agenda every 3 or 4 days, I can look back across time to pick out, threads of narrative on a particular subject. So one thing I do is include unknown or new drone models so that when I want to look back in the agenda, I can find them all more readily than having to search my feed in detail. So some of these are really just to alert you. So the first of which is a reference to the Topaz drone, which is a drone that had been reported on initially, but it hasn't actually been seen in use. It appeared in the background of this video with the Ukrainian Minister of Digital Transformation, Mikhailo Fedorov. And so that has some people's hopes up that Topaz drone may be deployed soon. Second link in the tweet comes from the UK Defence Intelligence, and they're highlighting that the UK has now decided to donate these Malloy heavy lift drones, which are pretty strong indeed. You'll see in the video they are being used apparently for CASEVAC, of wounded. So they're carrying human-sized cargo. The third link down is to a Ukrainska Pravda article that's highlighting a new FPV drone model that has been approved for use by the Ukrainians called the KHS-7. So I don't have too many details to report to you, but if you are really down in the weeds, go check that one out. Finally, the last link is from our friend Sam Bendet, who's noting that there's a new drone fundraiser that started by the Serhiy Prytula Foundation. And their goal is to purchase 2,000 FPV drones and to train 420 FPV drone pilots. The name for this fundraiser is called the Swarm of Revenge. So they've put some thought into the marketing of it. Okay, bear with me one second. The next block is a couple more updates on some drones. Okay. These next items I've included, even though they're not reported as going to Ukraine yet. They're innovations in drones from allies who have been very generous in supplying Ukraine. So I'm including reference to them here because of their novel nature and drone design, and also because they could potentially go to Ukraine down the road. So looking in the first item in the nest, you'll see the tweet from Artois about a new UK drone. It looks very expensive. It's called the Hydra 400, and apparently it's jet propelled. But what caught my attention is that apparently it's armed with brimstones, which are fairly advanced missiles. And in fact, Ukraine has been provided with brimstones, but they're at the moment being launched, even though they're normally intended to be aerially launched. We've seen innovation in their launch from these fixed trucks. Anyway, so it caught my attention because since Ukraine already has brimstone, if the UK is wanting to get a little bit of real field testing of a new drone type, what better place to use it than to let the Ukrainians take it for a run. The second item down is a new drone from Finland, which caught my attention because it's actually designed for anti-personnel, and we have seen the deployment of sort of like Claymore-type mines on unmanned ground vehicles, we have seen aerial drones dropping anti-tank mines most recently. In this case, it's a drone that's armed essentially with a Claymore-type anti-personnel mine on its bottom portion that then would detonate downward in sort of a cone of shrapnel. And so that was a design that I hadn't seen before. It caught my attention, so I thought I'd highlight it to you guys. The third link down was the announcement, again, first caught by our friend Sam, that the Antonov company, which is quite well known for its aircraft design, based in Ukraine, is now reportedly turning its attention to some drone manufacturing. Given its prominent place in industry, I mean, I'm a little surprised we hadn't heard about their involvement with drones previously. Perhaps they've been working away on some things in secret. But interesting to hear that, you know, a big industrial concern with lots of aircraft manufacturing experience is now definitely involved in drone manufacturing. Finally, and this relates to Russian weapon, but I was pretty sure we weren't going to get to Russian equipment today. So I thought it included talking about drones here. And that's the last item under the heading Russian Scalpel in testing. And so the Lancet we've discussed is a significant problem on the battlefield, one of the most effective Russian drones. Scalpel is a new model that is apparently considerably less expensive to manufacture. And these were the initial reports that versions of the Scalpel are now being submitted for testing in the field in Donbass. So, I mean, we'll have to keep our eye on that. Because if they, you know, have some similar effectiveness to the Lancet, but they come in less expensively and perhaps can be used in higher volume, that could be a significant concern for the Ukrainians. Okay, second item in the nest, a few more items related to drones. The first item, I guess before I go ahead, I see Exit put her hand up. Go ahead, Exit.
I actually saw Constantine come up and put his hand up, and I didn't know if it fell down by accident, so I thought I'd ask.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was moving too fast. Constantine, did you want to add in?
No, when we'll get to the... I came up because I heard the Antonov comments, and, you know, I thought it's something interesting for me to discuss. But, yeah, when we get to that, I'm going to comment. Thank you.
Well, so I just made reference to the Antonov company, and that's probably the only time I'm going to bring it up. So if you wanted to add in on that, feel free to go ahead now.
Okay, so regarding the Antonov, it's like for people who don't understand, while it seems like, you know, this is huge corp, you know, that has experience built on planes like Maria, and other prominent Ukrainian project like Ruslan. Also, those are huge planes that are super cost effective and quite popular in the heavy plane transporting companies. But the company itself is a huge bureaucratic mess, and it's not the first time they're working with UAVs. They made many big announcements before, starting from, I think, 2015 or 2016, and they never delivered. So I would, you know, and it's mostly because they're huge, they're underfunded, but they have big name. So it makes, like, I have really big doubts about them. They make a lot of fuss, but smaller companies that you know manage to get private funding really fast are much more agile and more effective and fast in developing drones. As like an example, you know, if for Antonov to do anything, they have to develop a huge package of documents just to start working. At the same time, while they're developing that huge package, we already have you know, drones like Shark, for example, or like that new jet drone is already developed and introduced working models, and Antonov will be still developing the documentation. It's just huge bureaucratic mess, unfortunately. I just wanted to add it because people get excited and try, see it as something to look forward for. I wanted people not to be, not to get their hopes up.
Okay, well, thanks for that additional context. I'm never frustrated if our enthusiasm is tempered with a dose of reality from those who have seen firsthand. So appreciate that. Okay, working from the second item in the nest, hopefully I'll go through maybe 2 or 3 more blocks, maybe 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes. And by the way, if anybody who's assisting me, co-hosts or our friends streaming, need to cut out early, no problem, totally understand because we're over time. The second item in the nest, just running through the links, the first one caught my attention because it's a significantly sized flak gun. It's being displayed at the military convention that's going on in London right now. Called DSEI. And in this case, it's a collaborative effort between a gun manufacturer and a radar counter UAS company out of Poland. It looks like it may actually be, if I don't know the word I'm looking for, it might not be palletized, but it looks like it's containerized, designed to be deployed on a truck bed. And so, it's the combination of drone-specific radar system with this kind of a gun deployable on a truck caught my attention. And interestingly, the tweet suggests that it's set to enter service with an quote-unquote unnamed country in the next 2 weeks. Now, I actually responded to that tweet to say, is there any additional information from the manufacturer written up about its deployment? Or is this just something you heard directly at the convention? I didn't get a response. But anyway, I still thought it was an interesting new bit of kit. And I think the implication was the unnamed country could potentially be Ukraine. But I suppose time will tell. The next tweet down was an article written in the Kiev Independent. It's under the phrase "race to win the drone war." And lots of the great analyst accounts, Michael Kaufman, Rob Lee, and so on, flagged this one as a good discussion of the ongoing battle in adaptation. So if you're really into drones, I'd encourage you to have a look at that article. In the last day, there were a bunch of people pointing to some very high-quality decoys that had been manufactured. Previously, we've looked at a few. We looked at inflatables some months ago. More recently, there were some sophisticated, wood and, synthetic, like plastic, high-quality decoys that were being made. In this,
I think we've lost him for a second. Jacoby, go ahead. Yep.
While we've lost Michael for 1 second, I just wanted to go back to the discussion earlier of Starlink. A listener, a sharp reading listener, shared with us that there had been around a couple of hours ago some reporting that the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee chairman had announced that they're probing into the events around that are being reported about Starlink, citing the idea that there's national security issues raised by the decisions that were made by the the manufacturer of Starlink, and that's something significant because it's chairman of a major committee in the Senate, and that they're looking into it is, both politics as well as not politics at play there. So it's something to watch and to see, at the end of the day, whether or not an investigation actually, a serious investigation comes out of it. But at the moment, the fact that a chairman of a major committee is announcing it is suggestive of the fact that they're taking it pretty seriously.
That is interesting. It would be interesting if they go ahead and have a hearing, and perhaps we wind up having all of these various explanations regarding the claim about cut of service finally worked out in testimony. So thanks for that. And apologies for disappearing there for a moment. As I get toward the end of our space and my system starts acting up, that's often a hint to me I should wrap shortly. But go ahead, Jacoby.
Sorry. I was just saying that I would put it in the replies for anybody who's interested in following that story.
Thanks very much. Okay, sorry, I was cut off in the middle. Speaking about these high quality decoys, this one came to the attention of observers because the Russians actually struck a system that appeared to be a fairly advanced radar system, but it was revealed that it was a decoy, and you can see in the tweet from OSINT Technical that it in fact has a moving apparent antenna array. So it seems like these decoys are continuing to climb the ladder of sophistication, which is interesting. Getting toward the end here. So again, I'm working from the second item in the nest. The fourth link down is an interesting argument about the economic implications. The example given by Luke Coffey here is to say, hey, look, if we give 40-ish HIMARS to Ukraine to fight an invader, then things happen. Like Poland then orders 486 of them in a deal worth billions and billions of dollars that support American jobs. Now, I mean, I'm not an American. I don't necessarily need to weigh in on American politics, but it certainly, does seem like a self-evident argument that this, as a reminder of the need to rearm and then a demonstration of what systems are actually effective in use, can win lots of new buyers, which is good news. And to that end, in addition to that HIMARS argument that Luke Coffey makes in his tweet, the next item down is about the purchase by Sweden of 48 new Archer self-propelled guns. And interestingly, Colby in this thread points out that while they say they're purchasing these Archers to replace those that went to Ukraine, apparently they've only donated 8 to Ukraine, so 48 is way more. And I highlight that because, there's a hope that some of these additionally acquired Archers may support further donations to Ukraine. The item, fourth back in the nest, the interesting ones here. So there was the announcement of the development of women's body armor, which is actually an item we talked about in a space about a week ago. So I included it here because there was somebody asked. The Ukrainians had highlighted a new women's uniform, but there was a question asked about armor. So now it seems like they're making progress on that front too. This one's the next item down is particularly interesting. Under the phrase, the U.S. sending monitors to track military aid. So this is a tweet from the Kyiv Independent. If you click through it, in their article, they link, it's a 2-pager document, I believe prepared for Congress, explaining efforts to monitor military aid to Ukraine. And embedded in that sort of 2-page handout is a discussion about the deployment of individuals to Ukraine to actually engage in the monitoring. This is something we've talked about a couple of times before as being a request, particularly from some Republican members. for oversight, even if only procedurally, just to make sure that funds are being well spent and that equipment is being well handled. So I consider that a positive development. Let's see here. A couple of other interesting ones. Denmark announced an additional amount of $830 million in military aid. However, that's due to be spread out over 2024 and 2025, but still good news. There have been some articles discussing the new orders for artillery production. And in a series of tweets, our friend John Ridge looked at those media reports and said, hey, the numbers they're using are not correct. They're considerably overestimating the cost of those artillery shells. I think in the news article, I don't want to click, it's 3 or 4 down in a quote tweet chain. But I think in the article, they say that it's something like $5,000 per shell. And John, via conversation with some folks who know in that industry, found that the actual cost of the shells is more like $700 per item. So this is sort of a caution to not take for granted figures, even if they're presented in major media outlets. Okay, I'll move to the 5th item in the nest as an update on some mobilization issues. In a moment, I'll quickly put up 2 little items on the meeting between North Korea and Russia, and I think we'll wrap after that, just so you guys have a sense of where we are. So that 5th item in the nest, this speaks to several efforts by the Ukrainians to crack down on draft dodging. And there are some strategies here for draft dodging I hadn't heard before that only came up in the last few days. And it's I suppose it's because of the crackdown that these strategies are coming to light. It's just weird to me that they wouldn't have been discussed earlier. And so the first strategy is apparently the Ukrainians were arresting some officials who would issue seafarers licenses in order to allow you to travel abroad as captains of merchant ships. And apparently they were selling these mariners licenses. I don't know if you can cross a border not on a ship, or whether you'd have to buy the license, get on a ship, and then sail across. I don't know who is inspecting these licenses. So I have questions. If anybody happens to look into them and get a better understanding of it, you can explain it to us later. Apparently some people are going to quite a length to avoid the draft. The next item down, again from the Kiev Independent, is there was an ex-clergyman who was arrested because he was helping people to avoid mobilization by, I guess, preparing fake paperwork that designated them as missionaries who needed to travel abroad. So we have merchant mariners and we have missionaries. And then finally, the third item down, we had previously discussed the ongoing investigation into the military medical commissions, where Zelensky initially replaced the heads of all of the military committees with veterans because he said, they appreciate how critical the mission is and have better insight into the life that the recruits will go through. But it was, I think, also an idea that there was some widespread corruption and they just needed to replace leadership wholesale. There were then specific investigations into people who are known to be corrupt, and their decisions for exemption were reviewed, but only theirs. And then just in the last few days, Zelensky has now signed an order or a decree that will require the review of all decisions by Ukraine's military medical commissions. So they've just gotten to the point of saying wholesale, all decisions have to be reviewed, which is interesting. Okay, I'll put up, I just want to highlight the developments with North Korea. As usual, I'll mention that there are all kinds of interesting additional items in the agenda that we won't have time to get to, including on diplomatic developments, economic developments, and Russian equipment. So I would encourage you to have a look at the threads in order to get some of those details as well. So the North Korean material should be in the nest now. And if you bear with me, I will, sorry, I just also want to put up the invitation to our next conversation. Okay, that invitation should be appearing in the nest in just a moment. So a reminder that our next talk will be on Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. We do hold these talks twice a week, Thursday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern, and Sundays at 4 p.m. Eastern. So you can set your reminder now, and I'd encourage you to join us then. Okay, the second and third items in the nest relate to the meetings between North Korea and Russia. I'll just highlight broadly, there's coverage as an overview from the Financial Times in the first item, where North Korea pledged its full support. Interestingly, there was lots of Russian media, television news coverage that was very glowing about the wonderful economy and social systems in North Korea, which caused lots of, laughter here on Twitter. But North Korea did pledge its full support. However, interestingly, Budanov was then quoted, and you'll see in the tweet from our friend Schizo Intel, who passed along a link that was put out by the ZSU War Telegram channel, that Budanov had come out and claimed that, in fact, North Korea has been providing munitions for at least a month, including 122 millimeter and 152 millimeter shells and Grad missiles. Beyond Budanov's claim, I haven't seen evidence of that appearing on the front line yet, but based on the claim, we'll have to keep our eyes open on accounts like Ukraine Weapons Tracker and the like. Interestingly, the third tweet down is from our friends at the NK News, which is one of the main outlets covering North Korea, that Putin also announced he had accepted an invitation to Pyongyang. So while they met in Vladivostok in Russia, in this instance, apparently Putin will be heading to North Korea. I didn't see much discussion in there about timeline, though. Again, the fourth link down from NK News, it was reported that so Putin actually took Kim Jong-un to a cosmodrome in Vostochny in order to highlight Russian space tech. And apparently there were promises that were made there that Russia would contribute to North Korean satellite tech. But interestingly, from the fifth link, you'll see that's from reports in the BBC, where some local Russian papers, now it may be speculation on their part, but have come to the conclusion that this is a big hint that Russia will actually provide missile technology, not just satellite, but that it will be missile technology that might help the North Koreans advance in their delivery systems for ballistic missiles, which obviously would have implications for their nuclear program. The last item I'll get to just before I wrap is the third item in the nest, which goes into some of the international implications of the meeting between North Korea and Russia. And so you'll see that in the first item there, that some folks, including in the article in The Guardian, are speculating that it may be politically difficult for North Korea to sell weapons to Russia if it weren't tacitly approved by China. And so that angle is an important one to look at. And I'm sure it's not lost on very many that that's likely the case. The second link down is highlighting that after it was first announced that Kim Jong-un would be meeting with Putin, the U.S. National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, came out and said, if North Korea does start to provide weapons, then they will pay the price, via sanction. But it's being pointed out here that at the same time, the U.S. is currently actively considering reversing sanctions on Iran, where Iran is also actively providing drones to Russia. And so how much weight will that warning from the United States regarding economic action bear if their actions, say the opposite in terms of cooperation with Iran, which is, all very sad. The third link down is a tweet from Arms Control Wonk, who points out that if North Korea does begin providing arms to Russia, that the concept of reciprocity in terms of if North Korea can do it, what will South Korea do? And to this point, South Korea has taken the position that it will not provide lethal aid directly to Ukraine. It recently increased its humanitarian funding. I believe initially they dedicated something like $300 million, and I think they just announced it's now $800 or $850 million over the next year. But Arms Control Wonk is suggesting that there are definitely some South Korean military systems that Ukraine would be interested in, and he highlights the Raybolt anti-tank missile and suggests, hey, if North Korea is free to provide weapons in this conflict, then South Korea might decide it should as well. And then I guess the last item I'll highlight is the last link in that block, and it's a tweet by Nolan Peterson. It's under the phrase North Korean espionage in Ukraine. And this is a very interesting story that I hadn't heard before. And Peterson is repeating it. And I believe it's mainly based on his firsthand knowledge of the situation, because he says that he had a friend who was acting as a Korean language translator at the time. He happened to be learning Korean in school. And his friend explained that I think it was 2 North Koreans had traveled from Belarus to Dnipro, but apparently they had in advance made arrangements that they were going to try to buy classified solid fuel rocket technology from scientists who were working at the Yuzhnoye Bureau. But the Ukrainians at this bureau were very suspicious of this, and they ultimately reported it to the Ukrainian intelligence, who set up a sting operation that ultimately arrested these North Korean spies. Now, I don't know if this would have been public, but it would be interesting to go back in the record, because the claim is this all occurred in July of 2012, just to see if there were any reports in Ukrainian media about the arrests. And so that's kind of a weird, closing the loop connection between North Korea missile technology and Ukraine. So I hadn't heard that until yesterday. So hopefully that intrigues you as well. Go ahead, Nukes.
Yeah, it's I didn't know this was going to come up, so I didn't have a chance to check back with the details, but it's pretty widely believed that Yuzhnoye, which formerly used MASH, which was Soviet Design Bureau, either the plans, parts, a working model, nobody quite knows exactly what, of the RD-250 engine, which is used on the North Korean ICBMs, actually came from Ukraine about that same time period. So and that story of the arrests and everything was published. It's been maybe not that exact incident, but the North Koreans poking around at Yuzhnoye has been a topic for arms control and for their ICBM program and missile tech program in general for quite some time now.
See, so I'm coming to it fresh, but clearly those who have been paying attention, it's old hat at this point. So I'll have to just dig into it on my own a little bit more. The part of the reason I wanted to speak to these North Korean developments is not only because it's generally interesting and draws in some geopolitics that we occasionally don't have time to cover, but it's still my hope that one of the journalists from North Korea News, who I've been chatting with, will be open to come and speak with us toward the end of the month as a guest. So I'm occasionally trying to highlight some developments in North Korea news so that the audience will have a couple more potential questions on their mind if we have somebody who can come in and speak to North Korea, because there aren't a lot of sort of open source people doing open source type work in the country or about the country. Okay, and I think with that, I'll call it because I know we're well over time. So I'll say thank you to everybody who came to listen. I always appreciate that you guys even show up. I'd like to thank all of our speakers. We highlighted some great work at the top of our conversation from Daniel and from Radio and Nukes. And I'd encourage you to emulate them by, if you have a little bit of expertise, start writing up threads, like Daniel has. And if you're a little further down the road and you have some unique stories to tell, start reaching out to some journalists like Radio and Nukes did with his stories about the B2 transmission interception. So thanks to all the speakers. I'd encourage you to check out their profiles. I think all of them have been following the war really closely since the beginning, and consider giving them a follow. I'd like to thank my co-hosts, Radio and Nukes and Exit. Without your help, it would be really hard to run these spaces. And so just a reminder, our next conversation will be Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. Hopefully you can join us then. And until then, have a good night.